Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. So today we are hosting the Sustainable Communities Division 4th Annual Climate Symposium, and we're so thankful to be able to partner with the Sustainable Communities Division. If you're unfamiliar with the Planning Webcast series, it is sponsored by APA chapters and divisions, and it brings almost every Friday a webinar worth CM credit on topics all over the board with planning from coast to coast. So welcome if you haven't been on one of our webinars before. If you have any questions related to technical issues, you can type those in the Q&A box and I will do my best to answer those. And for content questions related to the presentations, again, you can just type those in the Q&A box and we will get to those periodically throughout the presentation. And I'm just going to say it would be helpful if when you are asking questions that you include the name of the panelist that you would like to answer. It just helps us out on our end. Coming up on your screen is a list of our 2025 consortium members, all of our APA chapters and divisions. So thanks to all those sponsoring and hosting and making these webcasts possible and free to members. And today we are again sponsored by the Sustainable Communities Division, and we appreciate the longstanding partnership that we have with you all. Upcoming webcasts. These are just a sampling of some of our upcoming topics. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today, if you're sticking around for the next couple hours, today's session is worth 3 AICP CM credits, and 1 of the sustainability and resilience credits are available to you. This session, this whole event is actually listed as an event with specific parts. So you can either log a particular section of today's agenda or the entire agenda. And you can do that by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by the title or the event number, which are both found on our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. Just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and of course, a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast. Again, we'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so you get notified when new sessions are available for you to view. This symposium recording will also be available on the Sustainable Communities website as well. New this year, just scan that QR code, or again, just visit our website, ohioplanning.org, and you can sign up to receive 1 email a month from me letting you know what sessions are going to be available that month. So go ahead and again with that QR code and you can sign up to receive those once a month. I promise that's it. Emails from me. All right, that's it for my housekeeping items. I am going to now turn it over to you, Carla, to kick things off, introduce things, talk about the division, all that good stuff.
Wonderful, and thank you so much, Christine. We're so happy to partner with you on these events. Hello to everyone attending. Welcome to the 2025 Sustainable Community Division's 4th Annual Symposium. Special thank you to SCD's Partnership Subcommittee, shown on the upper right of your screen, Shannon Roberts, Anna Rosenblum, and Donnie Goris-Kolb for organizing what is an amazing lineup of speakers and perspectives for you today. SCD is offering today's program as a way of striving to empower you, planners, to create sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities. And we do this under the broader umbrella of the APA with many partners throughout APA's divisions, the national organization, and beyond APA. Sustainable Communities has 36 active volunteers, and we serve roughly 1,400 division members. We email news and resources to a list of over 7,500 recipients every 2 weeks. And we offer leadership through our 8 subcommittees, which are communications, education and practice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, membership, national planning conference, partnerships, policy leadership, and students and emerging professionals. We are especially proud of these symposia. This is our fourth, as you saw, as well as our annual Excellence in Sustainability Awards, our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Scholar Program, our Climate Champions Program, our NPC Scholarships, Smart Cities Leadership, FAICP Mentorship. We're proud of our internal processes to plan strategically and continually evaluate how and where to be more effective, particularly with respect to supporting national APA climate action and offering services and resources to SCD members on climate action. Our executive committee members have made contributions to PAS reports, the creation and the continuation of the AICP mandatory sustainability and resilience credit, the APA climate change policy guide, and last by no means least, our cross-divisional collaborations give us pride as well. These have produced the Planner Perspectives on Climate Survey, the APA Sustainability and Resilience Series, where there are 21 sessions available to date on demand for SNR credit, and the new International Division Sustainability Communities webinar series. And then I think we can move to the next slide, Christine. And before I turn it over, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors. We had, I think, at least 17 last year, and we are so grateful to each and every one for making it possible for us to do our work. If you are interested in sponsorship, no matter what kind of organization you are, we invite you to get in touch with us to talk about sponsorship, which is a very accessible way to get your organization in front of a lot of eyes on a regular basis. So please contact us if you're interested. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Shannon, I believe.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Carla. As Carla said, I'm Shannon Roberts. I'm a senior urban planner at Jacobs and the partnerships co-chair for the Sustainable Communities Division. I'm really proud to be introducing the fourth annual symposium focusing on climate change. We are thrilled to have a wonderful lineup of subject matter experts in carbon reduction strategies and climate adaptation for today's symposium. I am going to, just from a time perspective, let you know that the climate reduction strategies panel will be starting at 2:30 Eastern time, and and then the climate strategies, adaptation strategies at 3:45 p.m. So, but right now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Brian Ross of the Great Plains Institute. As a renewable energy team's vice president, Brian currently leads at the state and national level to integrate renewable energy and community co-benefits to enhance natural systems, meet host community land use priorities, and support agricultural business models. He is also an active member and supporter of the Sustainable Communities Division. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you, Shannon and Carla and Christine. This is always such a great group of people to work with. Let me get my presentation up. And do I need to swap it?
You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. So I've been given a few minutes here to kind of do a keynote. I actually see this more as a MC of the wonderful panels that we're going to hear from later. They're going to provide all the real detailed information. I'm just here to kind of set the stage and talk about kind of the importance of this climate issue as we think about our planning activities and as we move into the future. Just a little bit, I am the Vice President of the Renewable Energy Program at the Great Plains Institute. I am a longtime urban and regional planner. Been doing this my whole career. but I'm currently focusing on renewable energy work at the community level and state level. The Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization that is around almost 30 years old. We have about 80 employees. We're based out of Minneapolis, but we do work a lot of work in across the Midwest and a fair amount of work at the national scale. And our mission is to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy for the benefit of people and environment. And we are focused on the mitigation question primarily, but we also work on the resilience question because this is where a lot of people and communities first face the climate issue, and we have some great panels to talk about that today. So I just want to set the stage a little bit. We have a lot of climate leadership at the community scale, and I want to congratulate all the communities and people who are working for them who have taken initiative in order to kind of lead our nation forward in climate resilience and in climate mitigation. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that we tend to think of this, and people tend to think of climate issues as being something that happens at the national scale or the state scale, but it actually, the real work of climate happens at the local scale. On the mitigation front, the most ambitious governmental climate and decarbonization goals in the nation are those that have been adopted by cities, not states, not the federal government, not agencies. It's cities who have been providing leadership on the mitigation front and doing the most aggressive goals in the nation. They usually have to work in partnership to achieve those goals, and we're going to hear some great stories about that today from our panelists. But it is the place where we have seen people really step up at the local level in terms of kind of leadership on climate mitigation. And climate adaptation is similarly something that is felt first and foremost at the community level. This is where sea change is felt. Climate, sea level rise. This is where hurricanes, increasing levels and severity of hurricanes and other violent storms are felt. This is where flooding occurs. This is where wildfires occurs. And we have a great panel to talk about how cities are actually showing leadership on that front, both in terms of preparation for adaptation, as well as understanding how to recover from climate events, climate-driven events that we're increasingly feeling. But one of the things I want to emphasize with all the kind of kudos we want to give to our local climate leaders, that the practice and method of local and regional planning is changing because of the climate, whether your community is a leader or not. The stories we're hearing today are not about trying to convince you to become leaders. They're trying to help you understand that the practice of planning is changing, and we all have to adapt to that. This is something that even if you're in a community that has chosen not to take a leadership role on a climate issue, you're still going to have to address this. And so the markets are changing, the world is changing. It's changing the way that we have to do planning, and this is an adaptation process for our profession. The opportunity and the challenge we face in that regard is that we have to understand how the practice and standards of planning are changing. What is a local economic resource? The things we used to think about and we have for years about what is an economic resource is actually evolving, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. What is critical infrastructure? Things that are now coming forward as critical that we have to address, we didn't have to address in the past. One of the big things is, where are our community vulnerabilities? Places that you didn't used to be vulnerable now are vulnerable. Places that events that used to not be a big deal now are a big deal in terms of kind of understanding where our vulnerabilities in our community lies. What constitutes mobility and access in a world that is changing with the climate? What does long-range planning mean when you're looking at things like climate change, and how standards that have been in place in your community or in your infrastructure for decades and decades now have to evolve and change significantly. What are the kind of land uses that you're going to see as a planner that you didn't used to see? What is going to become normal? And what is new that we have to kind of adapt into our land use codes and our use tables? How do you plan for a resilient community in the face of a changing climate? These are the kinds of things that are changing our profession. So about, well, it was almost 5 years ago, the Sustainable Communities Division leadership was talking about what we needed to do as a division around climate. And we decided that we needed to do a survey. So it conducted a survey with the Sustainable Communities Division and the Energy and Natural Resource Division, and got something like, in the end, about 400 responses from members. And then this survey was repeated again in 2022, but for the whole APA membership. And the kinds of things, I won't go into the survey results and anything other than really this, is that one of the things we wanted to know from planners was, what are the tools that are most important to planners in order to achieve climate outcomes? And you can kind of see what came up. A lot of people thought they needed to understand how climate issues were addressed, resilience and mitigation issues were addressed in ordinance language. They wanted to understand what are the kind of goals that you need to set that different kinds of cities face. Is what Boston is doing the same as what Matamidi in Minnesota is facing? What are the examples of climate actions for specific kinds of sectors? These are things that really rose to the forefront about what planners needed to see. And so one of the things that the Sustainable Communities Division has been doing is trying to provide access to resources and to have discussions with planners about kind of what they need to see. And this symposium is one of those initiatives. So I'm going to talk a lot about some of the things that we face in the work that my team does on climate mitigation, not to diminish the resilience question at all, because this is critically important as well. But one of the things that we have seen as we kind of move, and one of the consequences of climate change is that energy markets are changing. And we are seeing a huge growth in clean energy development across the nation. We are moving from a system that was centralized to a system that is really community-based. In the conventional energy system, there were a few communities that had energy resources, oil, gas, coal, or that hosted centralized energy production, like big electric power generation plants. Most of the rest of the communities were energy consumers. Energy planning was done by states and utilities and big energy suppliers, not by communities. But climate change is really transforming energy markets and energy systems. And now communities are facing these new land uses and new infrastructure and new issues of resilience that they didn't before, such that we have to think about every community, as we say in the clean energy world, every community is a host community. It's no longer a matter of a few communities hosting and the rest of us just consuming. And how does that change the world we work in and planning? So here's a graph that data geeks really like, which it is a record, a historic record and a trend over time of the type and the number of electric generation facilities that are proposed and asking for interconnection to our nation's energy grid. In order to hook a new power plant up to the grid, you have to ask for permission and go through an engineering study. And that's called the queue, the energy queue. And this is the record from 2007 to 2023 of what we've seen in terms of proposed new electric energy generation facilities across the nation. This has been compiled by the Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and they do this every year. And there are two remarkable things about this graph that I really jump out, and I'm hoping will jump out at you. And one is that the sheer number of facilities in terms as measured by the number of megawatts of capacity from 2007 to 2023 has changed dramatically. Back in 2007, we were seeing about 438 new projects being proposed. In 2023, we're at 2,600. In terms of the, and not in terms of the number of products, in terms of the number of megawatts being proposed to putting on the grid. Just to put that 2,600 megawatts in context, the total number of megawatts of electric generating capacity in our nation right now, what is now producing electricity for us right now and has been for decades, is about 1,200 gigawatts. I was saying megawatts. I'm using the wrong nomenclature. We're talking about gigawatts here. 1,200 gigawatts is the total number of the total capacity of our electric energy system. There are 2,600 gigawatts of proposed new projects. And most of those projects, as you can see also, that yellow bar and that orange bar and the pink bar at the top are things like energy things like energy storage facilities and solar energy and other kinds of batteries. These are new land uses, and they're coming at us in a big way. And this is going to affect every community because there is no community across the nation that is exempt or is that does not have a economic solar energy resource. I work in the Midwest a lot. I just happen to have this number up as an example how this is manifesting in the Midwest where we are. Here's 6 states in the Midwest. And the total number of proposed solar development asking for interconnection to the grid. Everywhere, the smallest one of these states, Iowa, at 4,400 megawatts, that's about 33,000 acres of land that is going to be affected by that development. Illinois, out of these states, has the most, and the number of acres of land affected is approaching 400,000 acres. This is a lot of development, and this is all stuff that's going to happen within the next 10 years. So this is not an inconsequential event, and there is no state and no community really that escapes it. So we have a lot of clean energy and climate investment that's coming to your community. Probably nationally, over 10 million acres of land for large-scale solar development is the example we use, in addition to millions of rooftop and yard installations by households and commercial businesses. There's over 1 million public level 2 EV chargers that are going to be installed. These are just the ones in the public realm, in public parking lots and accessible to the public, not ones that are in the garage or hidden away in a parking ramp accessible only by a business. If we were to count those, there'd be about 28 million that are going to be installed. But just in the public realm, over 1 million level 2 chargers and probably 200,000 large-scale level 3 chargers, the direct fast charging. This is a land use issue, and it's going to come to every single community because the EV market, in spite of what we hear about slowing down, it's growing, and it's still growing faster than any other segment of vehicles. Battery storage, another thing that we're going to be facing, and that you may be facing. There's gigawatts and gigawatts of battery storage coming, and it's not just stuff that's happening in association with energy generation, wind and solar facilities. It's also happening at large and small substations that are located throughout our community. It's happening at our homes and businesses within our communities. These are things we're going to have to address as land issues, and it's coming to your community over the next 10 years. These are the kinds of numbers we're talking about, and it's coming whether or not your community has invited it. So we talk about energy transition in terms of the clean energy revolution that we're going through, and environmental justice a lot, those of us who are in this space. And a lot of times the energy transition is talked about as looking backward. It's talking about communities that used to have a coal mine, and now that coal mine is shutting down, and communities that used to have a gas-fired power plant, and that's going to be shut down in order to meet carbon goals, or just because it's no longer economic to operate. And what do we do in those communities about mitigating the impacts of transforming our historic fossil fuel economies and resource areas into a clean energy future. But there's a flip side of that as well. And this is kind of where a lot of planners need to be attentive. And that is there's a looking forward energy transition as well. Communities that have established and valuable economies and resources and cultures are also being asked to change. They're now being asked to be hosts to the clean energy system. And that is an environmental justice issue. How do we move forward on that in terms of mitigating the impacts of that change in those communities as the clean energy economy and the clean energy markets ramp up, and you see the kind of development proposals that people haven't seen before. One of the things we try to address is to say, think about these kinds of development proposals from the standpoint of a co-benefit approach to clean energy development, and that is something that has been talked a lot about in the climate mitigation world. The IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, who does all the estimates of how much our temperatures are rising and what kind of steps we need to take, have talked about this for decades now, about the co-benefits of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And they note here in 2007, it was in the report, most policies designed to address greenhouse gas emissions also have other, often at least equally important rationales. And here's a clip from an academic paper that kind of talks about the different kinds of things that can happen if you are trying to mitigate greenhouse gases that can also benefit communities. But the way we think about this really, if we're looking at those policies, they have those at least equally important rationales. Sometimes to the community, to the host community, what's most important to them is the rationale, the co-benefit, rather than the clean energy production. And the way we talk about this, when we talk about wind and solar and other things that are part of the clean energy economy, if you are going to restore watershed functions in your community, or you're going to diversify your agricultural system, if you're going to enhance habitat or create economic opportunity or protect your drinking water supplies, does it matter if you did it through building a solar farm? Most communities, I think, with an even-handed look would say, no, if we're going to protect our drinking water supplies by building a solar farm, and what we care about is protecting our drinking water supplies, then the clean energy development is that's kind of the co-benefit. What we've done is achieve our goals. And this is the kind of rationale that I think that we at the Great Plains Institute are really trying to put forward to help communities through the process of understanding how they can make development work for their priorities. This is not something being imposed on you from the outside, but rather something that you can shape, like you shape all other kinds of development, and planners are very familiar with this. How do you make a housing project work for your community goals? How do you make industrial development meet the kind of goals that your community has? And what are the steps you need to take in the development review and in your ordinances and in your permitting processes in order to make that happen? The same kind of thing can happen with clean energy, and there's a lot of ways that we can actually go through and do this. There is a lot of help that the communities can have. There's a number of different programs that have been put in place. One is called the RSTEP program, Renewable Energy Siting through Technical Engagement and Planning. There are 17 states in the nation that are starting these projects, engaging communities to identify what their needs are for planning, siting, and permitting of renewable energy, building technical assistance hubs, conducting workshops and trainings, expanding technical capacity. And you can see, look at the map, and you can see whether or not your state is part of this. This is a resource for local governments, specifically to understand and navigate through the clean energy evolution. Another project that we're working on, Great Plains Institute, called PV Success, is saying, how do large-scale solar arrays affect ecosystem services, both physical ones like watersheds and cultural ones like community character? The results of this is going to develop a decision tool that we want host communities to be able to use to make better decisions about how renewable energy development happens in their community. I mentioned the connection between solar and drinking water. This is another project that we're actually doing. A lot of communities have rural communities in particular are facing nitrate contamination issues. We're going to put solar farms on recharge areas to take agriculture off and eliminate that vector. There's national technical assistance programs such as SolSmart and Energy Ready, which is a bundle of programs including solar technical assistance, charging, EV charging technical assistance, and distributed wind technical assistance. Any community can take advantage of it. It's free, it's technical assistance, and the experts in it will help you navigate this process. And then things like agrivoltaics, which is the marrying and dual use of solar and agriculture in ways that kind of meet your community goals. So that's kind of the framing I want to do, and I want to pass it back over to our panels. And I really invite you to do this. And the final parting words I will say is a call to action that you should be thinking about projects that you can do in your community that help both with the resilience element and the mitigation element in terms of responding and creating those co-benefits as you start to see development processes coming. All right.
Thanks so much, Brian, for setting the stage for today's panel. Again, I'm Shannon Roberts. I'm a senior urban planner with Jacobs and the co-chair of the Partnerships Committee for APA Sustainable Communities Division. I'll be moderating the carbon reduction strategy session, which is focusing on how planners can incorporate carbon reduction strategies into their work through policy choices, supporting the transition to cleaner energy, and promoting complete neighborhood development. Our panel will detail how their work is actively reducing carbon and building stronger communities for the future. Our first panelist is Mohammed Patel. He is a senior transportation advocate in climate and energy for NRDC. Mohammed is responsible for engaging with state-level clean vehicle policies to equitably transition the Midwest to zero-emission vehicles, working on policies to accelerate EV charging infrastructure deployment, and advocating for programs to shift transportation investments to multimodal options. Please welcome Mohammed.
Thanks, Shannon, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Shannon mentioned, my name is Mohammed Patel. I'm a senior transportation advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council. For those who don't know about the NRDC, we are an international organization based here in the US that focuses on safeguarding the earth, its people, plants, animals, and the natural systems on which we all depend. NRDC has 3 million members across the US and a staff of about 700 lawyers, scientists, and environmental specialists working on policies and programs to confront the climate crisis, protect plants and wildlife and wild places, and ensure everyone has a right to clean air, clean water, and healthy communities. I am a transportation advocate, so I spend a lot of my time working with decision makers across the Midwest to advance certain climate policies that focus on reducing emissions from transportation. So I'll just jump right in. And I think that first off, NRDC's transportation vision is really intersectional. I think a lot of folks traditionally think about climate reduction within the transportation space as EVs and EV only. But as Brian was mentioning, it's a much more multifaceted approach. So NRDC's vision is to create a zero pollution transportation system that is equitably accessible, affordable, safe, and reliable. And there's sort of 3 ways and 3 barriers that we're hoping to overcome with federal, state, and local policy to accomplish this goal. The first is the electrify piece, which, like I said, is really focused on clean vehicles and fuels. And how do we equitably transition and invest more into more zero emission vehicle infrastructure? That infrastructure piece is under our Energize vertical, which is focused on reducing the barriers to building infrastructure, increasing that investment, and making sure that project delays and processes that slow down projects are removed. The last piece is called Transform, and the real focus is on shifting highway investments or just investments away from roadway expansions to public transit, walkable communities, and safe bike infrastructure. I'm going to focus most of what I talk about today on that last bucket. I think that, as Brian mentioned, many parts of the EV market and stuff are moving forward, and there is a lot to do on that end. But I think a less often talked about piece among the policy sphere is really on how do we shift investments and make sure that we are creating equitable options for people to move around as a climate reduction strategy. So briefly, want to just touch on what the status quo looks like here in the US. So transportation is the largest emitting sector in the United States. Roads and car-centric infrastructure act as heat islands. And as the temperature increases and we face severe heat, surrounding areas and higher temperatures will be worse in areas that have less green spaces and are more car-centric. The dependency on cars really shows true in a lot of these emissions numbers. So cars and trucks make up 40% of the total US embodied carbon emissions. It's extremely significant what tailpipe emissions contribute. And that's why there's such a focus on electric vehicles, because it's an easy one-to-one idea to mitigate those emissions. But there's also a great way to do that is to provide alternative options for people and goods to get around. A part of this is that vehicle miles traveled are on the rise across the country and significant in cities. And one final thing that I think is always important in this conversation is that over half of all car trips are less than 3 miles and 60% of car trips are less than 6 miles. So Americans spend a lot of time traveling by car, which has a huge impact on the environment and on our climate. But these are oftentimes short trips, which make them a perfect opportunity for alternative mobility options beyond cars. So diving into maybe some recent successes, like I said before, I focus mainly on the state level. So just wanted to highlight sort of the opportunity at the national level and then the state level, and then maybe get into some aspects of what goes on at the city level. From the highest level, though, we spend a lot of money on infrastructure in the United States, $200 billion on transportation infrastructure annually, and about 50 billion of that is on new roads and highway expansions. So even under 100% electrification scenario, reducing vehicle miles traveled in addition to that can provide even more savings in terms of carbon emissions, which we really need if we're going to meet our goals. And as Brian was mentioning, co-benefits are such an important part of this. So there's associated public health impacts, because tailpipe emissions are not just carbon emissions. They're nitrous oxide emissions, they're particulate matter emissions, which have been directly tied to asthma, lung disease, heart disease, especially in communities that border highways, warehouses, and high traffic areas. There's also household saving costs. People spend a lot of money on cars, and they spend less money on transportation if they have access to public transit. And finally, there is more household costs in terms of electricity costs that can be saved. And then lastly, there's safety, and so much safety benefits to reducing vehicle miles traveled. Just one thing I'd like to highlight in the graph on the right is if you look at the dotted line, that is the 100% EV adoption scenario with no change in vehicle miles traveled. And it looks like just a small amount from the business as usual scenario, but compared to this including VMT reduction, it looks like a relatively small amount, but that gap is the same as every household in America not using electricity for 5 years. So it may seem small when put in comparison with EV adoption, but it is significant. Some of the recent wins at the state level that NRDC has been a part of, and we are hoping to replicate in other places, is moving money from oil and gas production into transit service and frequency. These are some recent wins in Colorado. Adjusting land use policies to encourage density, so removing minimum parking requirements at the state level. Then just more money in general for transit access, and specifically, Colorado passed the law in 2021 that allows the state to shift funds from highways to transit, bus rapid transit, and alternative mobility. And I'll go a little bit more into that policy in a second. But as you can see, there's a lot of work that can be done at a policy, from a policy perspective at a state level, to really make large-scale investments change, so that there's more money that goes towards these alternative mobility options and VMT reduction strategies. So one of those state laws is Colorado's greenhouse gas planning standard. And this was a nation-leading rule where they essentially set a sector-wide standard of how they want to reduce emissions from the state's transportation system. And what that started with was assigning targets based on the state climate goals for each MPO and regional area within the state of Colorado. Then once they assigned those reduction targets, they had mitigation actions that were associated with it. So essentially within a state's transportation investment program, they had a certain amount of emissions that they could use between now and 2030, 2035, and so on. And if their program was going to come up over that carbon budget, they would need to close that gap with mitigation actions. So that could include more transit, bicycle infrastructure, transit-oriented development, vehicle charging, things like that. And you already saw that play out in Colorado in recent years. So that real impact shifted about $1.5 billion from road expansions into more multimodal options. As you can see, the estimated greenhouse gas reductions in that third column are very significant just from removing one highway widening project and shifting that same money towards bus rapid transit, bike, walk, and transit networks, and transit-oriented development. 680,000 metric tons of reduction, which is very significant. So it goes to show that, at a state level, there is a lot that can be done, but obviously there's also a lot that can be done at the city level. So one of NRDC's past projects with a lot of our partners was the American Cities Climate Challenge. This resulted from Bloomberg Philanthropies investing a lot of money after the election in 2016, when the first Trump administration began and removed the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. This was anticipated to put cities in a position to lead on climate action. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that over 80% of the US population lives in cities, and cities are responsible for 70% of our emissions. There's a lot of leaders in cities that can set agendas that roll up to state and federal action. A lot of innovation occurs. And in the end, as you all know, cities are where we are, putting steel in the ground. So a lot of the implementation challenges and opportunities begin and end in cities. So this was the map of cities, and I just put it to illustrate that there are probably a lot of resources for those of you that might live in or work in these cities or around these metro areas for climate resilience strategies and policies, or climate adaptation or mitigation, strategies and policies. So I would encourage you to go to the American Cities Climate Challenge website, find your city and see what some of the materials that have been developed there. I'll highlight a couple of them in a few slides. But there's some key elements that arose from this conversation, mainly that these 5 strategies could be used by people at the local level to enhance climate mitigation strategies, policies, and opportunities. So co-creating with the community. This means getting in touch with the community, doing public outreach, and ensuring that community-based organizations can actually help provide sort of a co-benefit relationship with government and government practitioners. This could be in the form of large coalitions working directly with folks at the city level to better understand an issue, and then using their power outside of the system to leverage advocacy opportunities to create change at a state or federal level. There's also a lot of cross-departmental and mayor-led work that went into this and was super effective in a lot of these strategies. And then making sure that there were very specific metrics on economic inclusion, and those co-benefits that we talked about earlier are so important to highlight. Public health benefits from reducing tailpipe emissions, home cost savings from adopting new technologies, and things like that are really important to emphasize to people, as Brian said, because it's a lot easier to get people on board that way. I'll just highlight a couple of policy documents that folks can go take a look at. From the American Cities Climate Challenge, there's a climate action playbook for folks in transportation. New transportation demand management implementation guide for city officials is super effective, gives a ton of new strategies for managing transportation demand and incentivizing more VMT reduction, and then a congestion pricing roadmap, if people are interested, has a lot of interesting data there. I've highlighted a couple of tools as well that people can use at the local level to justify a lot of these policy decisions, and I'll just describe them briefly here. So these all come from the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'd also recommend going and visiting their website. They have a ton of great tools to help practitioners really calculate the differences in from the current status quo approach. to other approaches that could lead to more mitigation. So their shift calculator on the left allows you to choose a metro area, put in the amount of miles that a highway expansion would be implemented in, and what the impacting benefits from induced demand, and then therefore climate emissions could come from that highway expansion. We use it a lot in our advocacy. There's an e-bike environment and economic impact assessment calculator. E-bikes have been shown to be very effective at reducing those short car trips I mentioned earlier. So this tool actually helps folks calculate what that impact would be if they were to shift a certain amount of vehicle miles traveled to e-bikes. It's been very helpful in incentivizing, e-bike rebates, but also more bike infrastructure in general. And then there's their smarter modes calculator, which really takes it at a state level, what the impact of VMT reduction will be on emissions in a certain state, based on an already existing electrification scenario. So also very helpful in seeing what the difference is and how VMT can be used as a reduction strategy. So just summarize, VMT reduction is a critical component of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Really focusing on replacing short trips can have a significant impact on emissions. In some cases, we're talking about shifting 25% of VMT, or just 1 in 8, even less. So 1 in 8 car trips in the Minnesota region resulted in 2.3, I think, natural gas plants not being fired for a whole year. So, 1 in 8 car trips shifting to a bike, a walk, a public transit can just have a really significant impact. Investing our transportation dollars in different ways. This can be really effective at the state level, and planners can be very helpful in elevating, what are the processes that exist at state DOTs that sort of entrench this idea of funneling more money into highway expansions. And then we can transition that into a policy advocacy framework that works to unpack that. And then finally, partnering and working directly with community-based organizations and nonprofits can really help translate the needs from an implementation side into policy action and advocacy. So I would really encourage folks to get involved in their local organizations or, their local transit union and things like that that could help shift a lot of these investments. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Our next speaker is Laura Jay. She's the Deputy Director of Climate Mayors. She recently joined Climate Mayors and will also be speaking from her experience as the Regional Director for North America at C40, Cities Climate Leadership Group, where she worked for C40's 17 cities in the US and Canada to help advance climate actions, from policies to mitigate emissions to strategies for adapting to climate impacts. Laura?
Thanks, Shannon, so much, and thanks for inviting me to speak, everybody. Really pleased to be here. I'm going to go over some few quick slides, and as Shannon mentioned, I am, as of about a week and a half ago, at my new job at Climate Mayors, but I will be speaking mostly around programs and resources that exist from C40, the organization I used to work for. So wearing a little bit of two hats here, as I'm recently in transition. Just a little bit of background. So I'm an urban planner by training, so I love coming to speak with urban planners, and I really work with mayors across the country and formally across the world on addressing climate change. So really always trying to bring the lens of urban planning in the way that we're all trained to think and take action on work to really help address the climate crisis. So I'm going to share my screen quickly, and hopefully you guys won't have any issue seeing anything. And okay, hopefully you can see what's here. So just very quickly overview of kind of my both hats in both organizations. So for those who don't know, C40 is a network of nearly 100 mayors from the world's largest and leading cities, really committed and working towards inclusive, science-based, and really collaborative approach to address climate change and keep global heating below 1.5 degrees C. And then Climate Mayors is a bipartisan network of around 350 mayors across the US, really demonstrating climate leadership through meaningful actions in their communities, representing 46 states and about 60 million Americans. So you can kind of think of Climate Mayors as a big tent organization, C40 as really smaller tent, but doing a little bit more deep dive on resources. So I wanted to kind of take a step back, do a little bit more higher level than maybe Hamid talk a little bit about some of the roles of urban planners and urban planning tactics around climate change, which I think really are a lot about the heart of what so many planners do across this country and across the world, and don't always connect it to the impact that it might have on climate change. So it's a little bit of keep doing the great work that you're doing and really think holistically about the impact that it's having. A mayor that I used to work with, the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who's a member of C40, really has spearheaded a lot of amazing transformations across Paris. I'm sure that some of us have tracked that with the Summer Olympics this past year. But this is pulled from a report, and I'll be touching on a report from C40 on the role of urban planners in addressing climate change, and then a program that C40 has called Reinventing Cities. So, she really kind of calls out the important role that urban planning plays as a powerful tool to tackle the climate crisis. And by adjusting regulations, local governments can really mainstream climate priorities that are really identified in the climate action plans and transpose those into concrete actions and policies. So I think really just a call to planners to think really creatively and holistically about the role and tools that they have at the regulatory level, and within their kind of toolbox to really help address the actions that are outlined in the climate action plan. So as I mentioned, that C40 has a report, I can put it in the chat or share it around later. That's a really fantastic resource for planners called, I got another slide, but addressing climate change for urban planners. And I think that, this is just a chart laying out some of the key areas to address. I'm going to touch just mostly on the mitigation focused one, since I know the next panel is touching more on the resilient side of things. But I think, my message there is nothing should be done in a silo. And so, whether something's a mitigation action, there's always an element that can address to resilience as well. So really make sure that you're thinking holistically about the approaches. And that there's also very much the kind of 10 common stages really of an urban plan, and the integration of different considerations on climate change throughout, whether it's implementing the plan and how you're engaging with communities, particularly those that are most vulnerable to climate impacts in your community, or those that have the highest energy bills, or those with the most outdated appliances that really are ripe for retrofits, or those with the least access to transportation, as Mohammed was just talking about. But so I think lots of different stages that really mirror as well a lot of the work that's happening on the climate action planning side, that really can combine efforts between planners and those on the sustainability side within cities. And here's a link or just a screenshot of the climate action guide for urban planners that I recommend you take a look at. Two kind of examples of, and this is again, from more of like the broad city planning perspective, which I think is a lot of, what many of us are learning in planning school today, or just in general as we think about the future development of cities, but really looking at polycentric cities or looking at the role of proximity. So I think in the United States, over 50% of trips that are taken are less than 5 miles. And so really thinking about how do we reduce the transportation use, and particularly the car use, to make sure that there are nodes around people's daily lives that are reducing the VMTs, but also providing them a better quality of life, and really thinking about that polycentric spatial strategy that can have a huge impact on carbon emissions. And really looking at strategies around counteracting single-use zoning, designated sites for local service hubs. This is an example from Seoul as part of their 2040 Seoul Master Plan, where you can really see where they've identified what are the urban centers, what are the metropolitan centers, and what are their local centers. And I think that the way that they define these are very much about the uses. So what are job hubs? What are neighborhood hubs that have different resources that different neighborhoods need? And I think, as we know, that can really reduce increased density in smart and strategic ways, but also reduce the amount of time and travel that people have to take around the city to get their basic services that they need. ground floor activation, reactivation of abandoned buildings, and design standards really are all different tools that can really help aid in creating more polycentric cities. The next is again, I doubt any of this is super new for you all, and I'm sure any planner in this room has seen this chart before on Barcelona versus Atlanta. But I think just the kind of the node to a more compact city is a more sustainable city, and that doesn't mean that every city needs to be Manhattan or that any city even needs to be Barcelona, but it's really about higher densities in the right places and really thinking smart about where people need to go when and really how to make sure that they're doing that in a more efficient way. I think this also speaks as well to the importance of intersection of housing and climate. We're in a massive housing crisis in the United States as well as a climate crisis, and they are inextricably linked. And so thinking about what role within a compact city model, when you're looking at the neighborhood level, really thinking strategically about how to increase housing, how to increase affordable housing in a way that's also ensuring that people have the resources that they need around them. They're not having to travel far to their jobs, that the homes are energy efficient and clean and healthy. And then I think incentivizing urban land infill, and I'll talk about a program that we have that touches on that. And then touch on the housing piece, really focus on this missing middle housing and really the importance of that. The program I want to touch on it's called the C40 Reinventing Cities program. And this is it's a innovative call for urban regeneration projects. And it's a global competition to really stimulate sustainable development and innovative solutions to environmental and urban challenges. And the goal is to create a space where cities and businesses can collaborate for really zero carbon urban regeneration and transform vacant or underutilized sites. So we've had about 20 cities participate globally in this. This actually started in Paris. They had a program called Reinventing Paris, where the city identified around 20 to 30 vacant properties that the city owned that they had been unable to develop. And so instead of taking a piecemeal approach to trying to get developers interested, it's site by site, and some of them were odd shapes and different situations. They created a competition that put them all together, and the city essentially said, we are going to prioritize the innovation of use on this site versus how much money we might get for it. In the end, we'll take $1 for it, but we want this site to be used. We want it to be redeveloped, and we really want it to be innovative in terms of how it's addressing climate change and bringing new scalable solutions to our city. And it was an incredibly successful project. And so C40 has worked for the past number of years to really scale out this program with cities around the world. In North America, Montreal, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, and San Francisco have all participated in this project and are resulting in really fantastic and innovative projects. So really how it works is that C40 works with the city to identify a set of sites locally and puts out kind of a global competition, a global call for ideas. The intent is this isn't just an idea competition, though. This is really about development. And so the city will, at the end, will be putting that, doing a sale of land to the developer, to the owner, to really have this develop. So this isn't just about a competition for the sake of a competition, but really to get it done. And really by bringing more of a global lens to it, you're getting more interest from those outside who might not be attuned to the different development opportunities in some cities around the world. So really looking then those kind of different project teams come together and really, pushing innovation, pushing a more holistic approach to who is involved in urban development. And so the competition has kind of 10 different climate challenges that touch on a number of different issues, and the city can determine also which are the priority based on their climate action plan, based on their urban, the urban land use plan and master plan, to really say, hey, we really want to focus on high quality design. We really want to be focusing on urban nature, circular resource within some of these different kind of challenges that have been identified. So just some quick examples, and then I'll close. So of, whether it's small plots, a dysfunctional square with, a lot of cars around it, how to retrofit it, an infill site, a disused facility, a dismissed rail yard, former landfill, a massive car parking lot, and really new development area. These are all plots that cities have put up that are currently being developed right now. So just my last slide, some quick projects that are under development right now. These are just the renderings, but they've all been selected and going through kind of permitting process and everything right now. Is I live in Chicago, so it'll be the first zero carbon high-rise building in Chicago that's going to be 100% affordable housing. First zero carbon neighborhood project in Paris that was more of a neighborhood regeneration. First zero carbon social housing project in Italy, and then the largest solar farm in the US built on landfill, which was based in Houston. So really exciting stuff that I think is helping put some of these principles into action.
Thanks so much, Laura. Very inspiring. Our next speaker, before I get to his introduction, I want to encourage folks to put any questions you might have for the panel in the chat. We will be having a Q&A after our last speaker speaks for the session. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. Our next speaker is Richard Zeke. And I know I pronounced that wrong, Richard, I'm so sorry. He's a technology project manager at Argonne National Laboratory. He's creating impactful education, workforce, and equity-centered programming, shaping sustainable transportation solutions, and building the next generation workforce to transition to the nation to e-mobility. Richard is the organizer of the EcoCar EV Challenge and leads the Equity for Mobility effort in this challenge. Richard?
Okay, can you see me in here? All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, Shannon. Going to share my screen. One moment, please. Let's see if I can get this going.
I think if you go up to slideshow.
Oops, sorry. Let me. All right. There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. So thank you for the introduction. As Shannon said, my name is Dr. Richard Zeke. I currently work at Argonne National Laboratory as a clean technology project manager. As most of my focus is on workforce development, particularly in the clean energy spaces. I help support a number of programs within Argonne focusing on workforce development in clean energy. One of those is the EcoCar EV Challenge, where we have 13 different universities of students who are working together, working in a competition to build an electric car from the ground up. This competition is very unique in that we have very close partnerships with industry sponsors like General Motors and MathWorks in partnership with the Department of Energy and Argonne. And the student teams basically build an electric vehicle from the ground up and incorporate automated technology into that car and then test out the car's ability to drive by itself. And so really this program provides an opportunity for students to have hands-on learning in partnership with industry leaders on the components of electric vehicle. It helps them to utilize their training in what they're doing in schools and apply it to real world applications. And we found that this type of experiential learning really helps them to get ahead of the curve, especially when they're looking for opportunities in the workforce within the clean transportation space. So I help manage a particular component of that program called the Equity Mobility Program, which focuses on students thinking about how their vehicle provides an opportunity for those who have some sort of accessibility issue to operate the vehicle. So really incorporating accessibility, diversity, equity, inclusion into the competition. And I've been managing that program since I started at Argonne back in October 2023. I spent about 80% of my time on that. And then 20% of my time, I focus on which is what I'm going to focus on in this presentation, which is on the Clean Cities, Communities, Environmental Justice Initiative. So let me go into that now. As you can see, what the Clean Cities and Communities Energy Environmental Justice Initiative is. Actually, let me put that. Oh, this is a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, worked at Argonne. I currently manage a lot of programs focused on STEM outreach, workforce development, and energy environmental justice. In terms of my previous experiences, I've worked at the Department of Energy, Urban Institute, Concerned Scientists, and Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. These are just some pictures of some of my family, friends, people that I've worked with, the opportunities I've spoken at TRB, worked on EV charging policy while I was at the Department of Energy, and I'm a chemical engineer by training. And so what I want to focus on is the Clean Cities and Communities Energy Environmental Justice Initiative. And I particularly want to focus on just what the program is about, because I think this program is applicable to the work that you're all doing. If you're not familiar with the Clean Cities Communities Coalition Network, it's been around for almost 30 plus years. And this network was developed to focus on building partnerships to advance affordable, efficient, and clean transportation fuels and technologies. And what we mean by affordable, efficient, and clean transportation technologies and fuels is that the sources can really depend on the communities themselves, right? So there's a lot of work focusing on the communities, these coalitions working with the communities to determine ways to diversify their fuel source, move things away from carbon intensive fuels into more renewable fuels. And so these coalitions work very close proximity with their communities. These coalitions help to serve as forums for local stakeholders to connect and collaborate on saving energy using affordable alternative fuels. These coalitions help to provide grassroots support and resources on new transportation technologies and infrastructure development, and they help to support networks that help the stakeholders identify cost-effective solutions that work locally. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really about using resources that's provided by the DOE, giving those resources to the coalitions, and the coalitions themselves, who are either independent nonprofits or under metropolitan planning organizations, work hand in hand with communities to help develop cleaner fuels that can provide cleaner air and a cleaner environment. Now, under this Clean Cities and Communities Network, we launched this Energy and Environmental Justice Initiative in 2022 as a Justice 40 pilot. So my lab at Argonne, we partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and we get funding from the Vehicle Technologies Office Technology Integration Program, which is under the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Division of the Department of Energy. This funding provides coalitions training, resources, and funding to pursue projects that prioritize community engagement and have underserved communities as partners, as critical partners. And as part of that, we try to develop these best practices for energy, environmental justice, and community engagement. And we hope to use these as a model to serve as a model for other Department of Energy and Department of Transportation programs. So it's just recently we launched this initiative to really focus on that energy environmental justice awareness, and really utilize the Clean City and Communities Coalitions Network to push those initiatives forward. And the purpose of this initiative is to invest in invest in Clean Cities and Communities Coalitions energy, environmental justice expertise, and capacity to maximize benefits to underserved communities through capacity building, community engagement, technical assistance, and training. So what do we mean by capacity building per se? So as I mentioned, we have 30 years of work working with communities. We've had engagements with, these coalitions have had engagements with over 20,000 stakeholders, and stakeholders could be from local community-based groups, companies in the areas they work in, nonprofits, governments, agencies, both local and state, and both local and state. And this really specialized engagement with these communities to promote clean technology, clean fuels, and cleaner technologies. And again, this focus on working with the communities. It's not just the coalitions with their expertise saying, "Hey, these are projects that we want to work on to help promote clean air transportation." It's really about, okay, what do you as a community want? The community-based organizations that we partner with, what do you want? And let's work together in order to achieve our goals. So we really encourage, these coalitions are really encouraged to co-create projects, to co-create initiatives in partnership with the community. Now, like as I mentioned, the community, the communities coalitions are tightly in line with Justice 40. And Justice 40 has had, as you know, had a number of different initiatives. And I would say even in this new administration, as you know, Justice 40 is not a priority anymore, but there's still an opportunity to really focus on these initiatives to help really broaden the community's engagement and provide a better environment for them. So that includes reducing energy and transportation cost, improving air quality, increasing access to alternative fuel vehicles, electric vehicle charging, and clean public transportation. Connecting a lot of these communities with funding information. One of the challenges is that a lot of these community groups and communities themselves don't have the wherewithal to look for funding opportunities, and so the coalitions help with that. Fostering business opportunities and economic development, which I think is going to be key, and as we move forward in this new paradigm. Providing job training, workforce development, providing jobs, providing new opportunities, providing new areas to get training and to get new jobs that could provide a higher quality of life in the clean energy space. Very important. Enhancing community energy diversification, resiliency, and decarbonization, and then just building general capacity. And capacity can mean many, many different things. So these are some of the coalitions that participate as part of the Energy Environmental Justice Initiative. We've had 3 different phases. We bring in a number of different coalitions to in each phase to do training, to do webinars, to do workshops. We have about 75 of them currently right now who are participating in the general coalitions. And then within the Energy Environmental Justice Initiative, and the other programs that we working under this initiative, we have a subset of these working in that. So this is just a map of all the different coalitions across the country that are active in this program. And as I mentioned, there's different phases, right? And we started this in 2022. We've continued it through present day. And so we first had a webinar series to reach out to all the coalitions, all 75 of them. These are some of the webinars were including understand energy equity, understand how transportation and mobility equity works, mobility equity frameworks, community-driven transportation equity solutions, rural and travel transportation, and fleets as well, which is a big part of our work. And then we reduced that down to 29 coalitions. And then we had a deeper dive into these workshops. So we talked about orientation and visioning, introducing metrics, methods, and tools, doing community engagement and being strategic about what that means, and then move forward to next steps, which entailed in the Community Engaged Liaison Program, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. So then when we reduced to next go to phase 3, we reduced down to 17 coalitions, and these 17 coalitions are actually part of the Community Engaged Liaison Program, which I'll talk in the next slide. So these are the 17 that are currently in this program, and we are right in the middle of our ending this first cohort of 17 coalitions, and we just brought 15 more into our second cohort, which will start in the beginning of 2025. And so we got these 17 coalitions, and we really did a deep dive into helping them understanding what their community needs are and how they can utilize a liaison, which we provided funding that the coalitions could use to hire someone to really do that on the ground community engagement work. And we talked to them and trained them on what they needed internally, how to write a job description for this community engagement liaison, how to develop a transportation action plan, and then train them in program and project planning. And this all happened in 2023. And then I said this community engagement liaisons, they basically provided funding for them to hire these liaisons. And these liaisons are members from the community. And they do this deep dive into relationship building with these community-based organizations in their community. So one of the things that we heard from community is that, especially from a agency like the Department of Energy, which is a huge bureaucracy, when we try to do actual engagement, these communities feel like, well, they are in this one, they are here for one moment, and then next moment they are gone because they have other priorities and we get left out. So this initiative was to really say, okay, we don't want to be a organization that just gets in and gets out. We want to provide funding, and we understand that it's not the department that is going to be the best group to engage the community. It's really about supporting local communities, supporting local people who live in the community, who work with these community-based groups, and have them be the ones that actually do the on-the-ground engagement, and we just provide support. So these liaisons were hired in last year, and they focused on relationship building, going to being in the community, going to like community group meetings, and really being involved, helping these community groups pursue projects and accelerate projects that they are interested in. So it's finding funding, building relationships with CBOs, pushing projects forward, helping to connect those projects to the metrics, to the priorities in Justice 40, and then utilizing their expertise in equity and community engagement, providing that insight to the coalition so the coalitions can be more effective in working with those communities. And then lastly, I'll conclude with the major deliverable that we've asked our liaisons to do, which is a community transportation action plan. These projects, these CTAPs, are projects that follow a comprehensive process to identify the specific needs of traditionally underserved communities. These goals of CTAPs include collecting baseline information on transportation and transit pain points, creating priority lists for potential projects, and then working directly with community members that create iterative solutions that are successful and accessible to all. And so in summary, we have asked the liaisons to develop these plans, and they've already identified the groups. They are building relationships. We've had them come into trainings where we provide kind of guidance and insights and reviews of their plans, and pulled out some of the best practices and shared those best practices across all the coalitions, because we found that one liaison in one specific area of the country, their practices or their priorities or their work can actually apply to other areas and build partnerships. So we do a lot of peer sharing and a lot of best practice sharing. And so right now, where we at is that we've evaluated plans, and now we have our liaison. We actually now have funding for liaisons to actually go into communities and implement these projects, which is great, right? It's one thing to develop a plan and have it on paper. It's another thing to actually be able to move forward with actually doing some work, which historically has been kind of the barrier. And now we have funding to do that. And over the next year, the 17 coalitions that I talked about will be able to actually go into the communities, work with the groups that they've already researched and worked with, and in a sense, and say, hey, we have funding to actually build bike share projects, or that can deliver food to communities, or empower local groups to advocate for better transit, or focusing on electrical ride and drive programs to educate the communities about electric vehicles or electric carts that can also be used in times where if the if gas-powered vehicles are not available, using them to transport people in natural disasters. So there's a lot of other projects here. And so I wanted to share this program about it, particularly because I think it relates to the work that you all as planners are doing, community engagement, working with community-based groups, doing on-the-ground partnership work to really push priorities of clean energy forward. This program very much is in alignment with what planners like yourselves and organizations are doing. So this really shows that the Department of Energy in partnership and my lab and NREL and all the other partners that are working together really provide a focus on community engagement. So I just want to kind of share this program to let you all know about the great work that we're doing. And if you have any questions about the Clean Cities Communities Energy Environment Initiative, I look forward to hearing them. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Wow, that's really inspiring work. I love the empowering the community aspect of that. Yes, our last speaker is Donnie Goris-Clove. He is a senior sustainability planner at VHB and is also my co-chair for the Partnerships Committee for the Sustainable Communities Division. He provides technical and advisory services across VHB's footprint in the areas of sustainable design and development, urban and regional planning, and environmental consulting. Donnie?
Thank you, Shannon. And I'm pleased to be here today to present on my particular project. It's at a project level, but before I do that, I just want to say that this is my 4th year engaging in this wonderful program, the Climate Symposium. And this year I'm able to speak, so I'm increasing my participation, and I'm glad to do so. And it's come back every year, folks, because it's great. And as long as I have the floor, I would love all of the time that's left within our allotment, but we haven't received any questions, and we'd love to give the other presenters some questions and opportunities to respond to their projects. So, please post any questions that you may have on their presentations or mine in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and present my slide deck. All right. Can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
All right. All right. So I've had the pleasure of working with the Pioneer Valley Regional Planning Commission in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. They cover a 2-county region, Hampshire and Hampden counties, on working on a charging assessment and deployment plan for EV charging infrastructure. So I'm going to be presenting on that today. But before I get into the project itself, I just want to make sure I know there's a variety of different people and coming at this topic from a number of different angles. So just talking about electric vehicle charging, kind of being a 101 very briefly, but I want to define the various types of EVs and EV charging equipment, but also talk about equitable access specific to garage orphans, which was a focus of this particular project, and the role of local government in deploying EV charging and making that more accessible to the broader community. And then I'll get into the project in terms of how we develop the EV projections and the distribution of the charging infrastructure that is demanded by those projections, and then speak to some recommendations, some case studies. And then we also developed a model EVSE bylaw that can be used by any of the municipalities within the Pioneer Valley region. So there's a few points that I want to make there as well. Now, I'm contractually obligated to say that the project was funded through the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, but also that the views and recommendations included in the presentation are not necessarily those of the Federal Highway Administration or the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So with that out of the way, just getting into the different types of EVs, we kind of refer to electric vehicles as being as one pot, right? But, they are battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and hybrid electric vehicles. And hybrid electric vehicles are considered electric, but they don't have their own electric-only range capabilities. So we're not considering that as part of our study. We're only considering the versions of electric vehicles with plugs. So battery electric vehicles, which is entirely plug-in and has longer range longer ranges based on their larger battery capacities, and then plug-in hybrids, which have a plug and a internal combustion engine, have smaller ranges based on their smaller battery capacities. And then when we're talking about charging infrastructure, we have three different levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, and that they increase in terms of their charging speed, depending on how what kind of connector that you have and in your vehicle, and what kind of speed your vehicle and the charger within your vehicle can accept. There's a variety of different connector types, and they're standard. So the J1772 is pretty much standard, and if you combine that with the DC fast charge, then you get into the combined charging system. The J3400, or also known as the North American Charging Standard, also known as the Tesla charger, that enables a level 1, level 2, and a level 3 charging speeds. And then there's CHAdeMO, which is not necessarily a standard so much anymore. It's on its way of being phased out, at least in the United States and in many other locations. This is a wonderful graphic. It's a pyramid. The category of charging types are within the pyramid, moving from home to interstate DC fast. As you go up the pyramid on the right-hand side, you notice that it's based on time sensitivity and whether or not the charger is going to be public or private. So when you start at the bottom at home, you're less time intensive. Like, you can plug in overnight and reasonably expect to get a full charge if you have a level 2 connector. But that's entirely private. And the more you go up the pyramid, the more time sensitive you are. So if you really need a charge and you need that charge quickly, then you're going to be, in the case of, as an example, interstate travel, then you want to stop at a DC fast charge station. But there is increasing capital costs, and there's also increasing, and it's not covered on this particular pyramid and graphic, but increasing electricity consumption costs too, because the higher the charging speed and the more advanced the charging station, the higher the capital costs, and also the higher they end up charging you on a per kilowatt basis. And you also have some non-owner involvement. So if you are an installer or somebody that is going to be and looking to install EV charging infrastructure in your community, you do need to engage others, partners, when you're, the more complex the charging station that you're looking to install. In terms of equitable access, I want to focus on garage orphans. This is not necessarily, when speaking about garage orphans, I don't necessarily mean only, low income or minority populations or environmental justice. Garage orphans can be very well-to-do individuals that are living in a condo type environment, for example, or any densely populated area that, they just don't have access to dedicated chargers in their garages or in off-street parking areas. So this is a big issue, particularly for low-income and minority populations, environmental justice populations, because they do end up, being concentrated in urbanized areas typically. So we want to make sure that we are addressing all of these populations more broadly as we look to proliferate and increase that EV adoption rate, so we can meet our climate goals. But in terms of challenges for garage orphans, obviously they lack the infrastructure, and when you don't have the dedicated chargers, you do lack the convenience factor. There's street parking limitations. It's impractical, or they're non-existent charging options, and just to remind everybody, street parking is not guaranteed. So if there's curbside charging and there's a number of curbside chargers, you can't necessarily rely that you're going to be able to park in those in those spots to charge your vehicle when you need it. And then economic and equity issues, of course, as I mentioned, when you do need to use public charging stations, you end up paying higher cost on a per kilowatt hour basis. And then there's policy and planning gaps. There's just not a lot of government action. In many different communities, considerations for providing EV charging for these demographics. And just to note, like, going back to this pyramid, if you don't have charging in your home and you don't have charging in your workplace, then you do have to start to engage with public charging stations. And the more that you need to engage in public charging stations, again, the convenience factor goes down and the complexity of it goes down. And with that, the likelihood of those individuals purchasing EVs, and again, working towards our climate goals. In terms of a local government role, just making sure that we're implementing EV-friendly regulations, streamlining approvals, promoting adoption, and ensuring safety and accessibility through our bylaws. equitably distributing EV charging stations, so making sure that they're in the underserved communities, but also in other areas where garage orphans, and place charging stations near local businesses and amenities to boost economic activities. So this goes hand in hand with, where people want to charge. I know I enjoy charging my vehicle at, when I go to the grocery store. It's that convenience factor, making sure that things are accessible to folks particularly when they do require public charging. And then promoting the use of EVs to support the climate goals. Every climate action plan has a sustainable transportation element, and every sustainable transportation element includes electric vehicles. So this is a big component of what we're trying to do holistically. In terms of our actual project, again, we were working with the Pioneer Valley Regional Planning Commission, and again, it's a 2-county area. You can see the map and all of the different towns that are involved. Just to put it in the geographic context, this area includes UMass Amherst. It also includes Springfield, Massachusetts. So if you're familiar with this particular area, on this particular map, we also have the urbanized area identified. So we did, as part of the study, update the region's EV charging infrastructure. So you could see that all of that infrastructure is concentrated within the urban areas. And that's, where the people are, but we also need to be cognizant, not just of, those folks that are, garage orphans and don't have access to public infrastructure, but, folks in the rural areas too. So not everybody is going to be able to install a level 2 charging station themselves in these rural areas, and consequently they do need their own access to public charging. We also conducted the public charging prioritization plan and conducted an energy demand analysis associated with that. I spoke of the model bylaw, and then we also did some public engagement that was incorporated into the analysis. I'm not going to cover the EVSE inventory or the public engagement so much as part of this presentation, but we did conduct a robust public engagement effort as part of this project, and the results were incorporated into where, particularly where people would like to charge into the analysis. And speaking of the methodology for projections and distribution, we projected EV ownership using historical and current vehicle registration data and looking at EV adoption rates. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation has a wonderful dashboard for their vehicle registration, and those vehicles are broken out by the fuel type. If you are lucky enough to live in a state with that level of data, then that's great. You can conduct a very similar analysis. Otherwise, when we have worked with other organizations or other entities, getting that data has been, quite difficult, and numerous assumptions have to be made at this stage of the methodology. We estimated charging infrastructure demand by charging type for both publicly available and shared private locations. So those shared private locations include multifamily and also workplace situations. We reviewed the census data and other demographic information to identify where the densely populated areas are located within the region. Also reviewed land use data to identify the clusters of the land uses that are important for this analysis. So again, multifamily housing, commercial retail land uses, and employment centers. And we used and made sure that the land use codes that we were incorporating into the analysis matched the things that we were hearing as part of the public engagement effort. And then we performed an overlay analysis using the projected EV charging demand and married that to the demographic and land use data to determine regionally appropriate distribution of EV charging supply equipment or charging infrastructure. And then applied that afterward, we applied another criteria to understand, okay, well, how do we distribute this equitably? So we used an environmental justice analysis, the REJ plus data that Massachusetts Department of Transportation has developed and VHB has supported the development of, but it's a regionally adjusted EJ data set that looks at not just minority and low-income populations, but other demographic criteria, including disability and more. This was for the level 1 and level 2 analysis. For the level 3 or the DC fast charge analysis, that methodology is quite different. We conducted a 15-minute drive time analysis in urbanized areas, and then conducted a 10-mile road distance analysis in rural areas, all from existing charging infrastructure. The reason for the difference is that rural areas are used to driving a little bit further for the things that they are requiring, whereas in urbanized area, a drive time analysis takes into account things such as time spent in traffic and streetlights and things of that nature. And then we overlaid the results of those with the projected EV ownership that we distributed via the same model that we undertook as part of the level 1 and level 2 analysis. And we were able to identify where the gaps were and how that infrastructure should be distributed. Here's a quick look at some of the maps that were developed based on the analysis. So you can start to see, this is all for the level 1 and level 2 analysis. But we looked at, again, distributing it based on various criteria, but you could start to see where and how. And we did this by block group, by the way. So we tried to get as closely, as small a geographic region as was possible with the amount of time that we had to conduct the project, and to reasonably give municipalities within the region a good sense of how many charging ports would be required by charging type, so that they can conduct their own deployment planning based on the numbers that we're providing to them. So we looked at the level 1 and the level 2, and as I said, we applied a EJ criteria that allowed us to prioritize the distribution based on where environmental justice populations were residing. Some of the recommendations and case studies that we identified as part of the project, we focused on environmental justice communities, making sure that public charging affordability is present. There's a good case study with Valley Clean Air Now. They have an equity charging card, and that is sort of a charging credit. You can either use the debit card for the purchase of a charging station, or you can use it for paying for public electricity consumed at public charging stations. Community engagement and education, just continually engage, make sure that you're putting in charging stations or planning for the deployment of charging stations where they're needed the most, and what are the barriers for environmental justice populations to purchasing electric vehicles and accessing those charging stations. What are we not hearing? What are we not seeing? What do we don't know that's preventing them from participating in this this technology innovation? Targeted funding. So this has been a topic of conversation over the last couple of days. A lot of the charging infrastructure funding that has been distributed from the federal government, of course, is wide-ranging, but a big focus of it has been environmental justice populations and covering gaps where there's charging, where there is no charging infrastructure, and where private charging infrastructure developers aren't installing charging stations. So just making sure that when funding is obtained for EVs, that you're considering the map of environmental justice communities within your city or town. Addressing garage orphans, curbside charging infrastructure is good. The city of Boston has a big goal of making sure that residents are within a 5-minute walk of all EVSE, but it's not the only solution. City of Cambridge has a parking and charging rights bylaw, so making sure that nobody within a building is prohibited from installing an EV charging station or charger if if the landlord is is against it, for in simple terms. Electric car sharing and ride for hire, we didn't touch upon this too much in the report, but it is an option for people who just don't want to purchase electric vehicles, because maybe people don't want to purchase electric vehicles or don't want to purchase a vehicle in the first place. So having a comprehensive transportation plan, EVs plus public transportation and plus opportunities in between, these are the opportunities in between. Access in rural communities, just one of the big things that we identified was network connectivity, cell phone coverage. That was a big issue, particularly in highly elevated areas. Accessibility, making sure that usability, payment systems are usable. And when you do engage in contracting for the installation of EV chargers, that maintenance packages are provided, or you otherwise have a plan for maintaining that asset, and that reliability standards are established. So a certain threshold needs to be met in terms of the amount of uptime, so 90%, 95%, somewhere around there. And then there's also addressing the electric grid constraints that I won't get into, but there's a number of different opportunities to make sure that you're not putting additional stress, or at least mitigating the additional stress that the EV chargers are putting on the grid. The model bylaw, and I'll go quickly through this, but we made sure that and we suggest that there's a clear purpose. So here are 3 things outside of just maintaining a and creating a sustainable transportation network. Enhancing energy efficiency and vehicle to grid, vehicle to load is, part of that, and we incorporated that into the model bylaw. Promoting equity, making sure that, we're not excluding certain populations as part of the bylaw, but making sure that there's accommodations or provisions for the proliferation of chargers within those communities, and then coordinating community efforts. The purpose of this particular model bylaw, when adopted by an individual municipality, is to make sure that anything that's being installed within the community is coordinated in a manner that is consistent and reliable and meets expectations for the town's constituents. And then consistent definitions. We came across this a number of times. It's an industry issue. What is a connector? What is the charging port? What is a charging station? We clearly defined it so everybody's on the same page. Similarly, EV capable, EV ready, EV installed, conduit, prepared to be plugged in, and then you actually have the charger installed. Key regulations and provisions, permitted locations, accessory versus a service station, classifying it as a service station depending on how large the charging station is. Proposed parking requirements you see up to the upper right-hand corner. We consolidate all of Massachusetts recommendations across its stretch code and commercial, residential and commercial stretch codes to make sure that everybody was on the same page about how many charging stations or chargers they should require per parking area. Design standards in terms of equipment, lighting, and signage, make sure you have that. Accessibility and ADA accommodations, that's a big focus as well. We have an example of how that could be accommodated on the image on the bottom right. And then connectivity, again, particularly for rural areas. There's much more in the model bylaw, but I would like to just kind of focus on those particular aspects of it. If you're interested, there's the bylaw plus the report is on PVPC's website, pvpc.org. And I'm Donnie Goreskolb, and thank you for listening to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Donnie. I think we are out of time for Q&A for this panel, unfortunately. We want to keep everything moving forward. Donnie, there was a question I wanted to answer live, but I would direct the panelists to answer the questions in the Q&A chat. But there's a question of how do you determine which multi-units would have level 1 versus level 2 chargers?
So that's a good question. So what we ended up using was a model that determined a certain percentage of a population within a building would require level 1, or could get away with using level 1 charging, and then a certain number of residents would require level 2, and that wasn't necessarily like a 1-to-1, like you're only going to require a level 1 or you're only going to require a level 2. But there's certain models that's produced by NREL and others and accepted by others that can be applied that say that, okay, given a certain population, this number of level 1 chargers are going to be required, this number of level 2 chargers are going to be required, and then we just aggregated that as part of the model and distributed that based on how many multifamily units. And then we did it on a per unit basis. We didn't say this is a multi-unit building. We did it on a per unit basis. So we took that model, filtered it down, and applied it to individual developments by their number of units.
So they can try to figure that out by looking at your report.
Not necessarily.
It sounds like it's a more complicated answer.
It is more complicated, but there are resources that are out there that can guide municipalities. EV Pro Lite is a tool that is produced and put forth by NREL and also DOE, Alternative Fuels Data Center, promotes that. So if you have this number of registered vehicles, you could plug that in there, and then you can get your what that distribution may look like.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much. Anna, I'm going to switch it over to you. So right now we have all 3 of our co-chairs on the screen. So just want to thank you all for the partnership, but go on. Anna, I'll turn it over to you so we can get moving.
Sounds good. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to our panel one presenters for sharing your expertise. That was really very interesting presentations there. I'm Anna Rosenblum. I'm a senior associate with Evolve Environment Architecture, and as Shannon mentioned, one of the partnership co-chairs. So worked closely with Shannon and Donnie to put together this symposium today, and really glad you're all here joining us. So I'll be moderating our second panel, our final part of the program this afternoon, which is focused on climate adaptation planning. So as climate change continues to intensify, we're going to experience more frequent and intense climate events. I know we've all had our eyes on the news the past couple of weeks about the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles, and many other climate events over the past few years. So more frequent and intense hurricanes, more flooding, and much more. So adaptation planning has become essential to help communities not only prepare for and bounce back from extreme climate events, but also to manage the stresses and recurring impacts that continue to intensify every day. So this panel will include 4 presentations from 5 speakers, and they will share some case studies and tools that planners can use to help communities prepare for and adapt to the changing climate. So similar to the first panel, each presenter has about a 10-minute presentation. I'm hoping we have enough time for some question and answer following the presentation. So highly encourage you to write those questions in the question and answer box as you hear each of our presentations this afternoon. So our first presenter is Katrina Kelly-Patu, who is a Senior Principal and Director of Climate Change Adaptation and Economics for Smith Group. And she'll be speaking about Resilient DC and Climate Ready DC. So Katrina, I will pass it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Anna. Let me just make sure. Is everybody seeing my screen okay?
We're seeing it with the slide sorter on the side.
Okay, perfect. Give me 1 second. Okay. Well, thanks for having me today. As we dive into the world, I guess, of adaptation, knowing that we have 10 minutes and we don't want to be overwhelming, we decided to do a bit of a presentation today on a recent project that we did for Climate Ready DC. We did a big partnership. We actually subbed, which is a little bit unusual for us, but felt really authentic and really cool. If anybody hasn't worked with or is familiar with Latoya Thomas's work with Brick and Story in DC, she's an engagement specialist who's been working in the area for quite some time. They brought us in because they wanted to understand how to translate really kind of complex scientific stuff, but also talk to the community who is experiencing some pretty hardcore climate events now. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with adaptation, to just level set, a lot of the work that our team does and that this project is about is really about how you handle those immediate vulnerabilities now. What kind of, I guess, whenever you looked at the previous panel and you've heard about the long-term stressors from climate change, how we're decarbonizing systems, adaptation is really about how you are handling those immediate shocks that are having from them. A lot of the presentation today I'm actually going to talk about, which is why people are so important to bring into these processes. As I said, we started as a sub and we ended up being kind of the science translators, if you will. We worked with the Department of Energy and Environment, DOEE, in Washington, D.C., but also Homeland Security and Emergency Management. The overall thing that we really wanted to understand is, what does it actually mean to be climate ready right now? What are really the lived experiences of people dealing with climate change? For the planners on that call, and I think even after seeing some of the presentations, one of the things that we're conscious of for decarbonization is there's tons of information out there, and we're constantly updating our data sets to be able to give us a bit more understanding of how far we're coming on decarbonization. Adaptation is tricky because for a lot of the places that we've been working in, specifically in Virginia and Michigan, what we've seen is that data actually is a bit of the problem here. The people are really, again, a bit of the heart of this solution, because those lived experiences can very much tell you how the future is different from the past. So Working with our subs, we actually had 4 main tasks on this project, and I think that they're really replicable and something I encourage everyone to kind of take into their planning processes for adaptation going forward. Historical data is kind of where you start off with, reviewing existing climatological conditions. So understanding what FEMA has gathered, what your watersheds are looking like, even how precipitation is happening. You just want to get a baseline understanding of the Farmer's Almanac version of what's happening in your region or not. But then you want to do something really fun, and this is what we've started getting more and more into, which is really understanding what the future looks like. And this is where the community's lived experiences really go into that. We actually partner with Swiss Reinsurance and use parametric modeling to understand what future climate scenarios look like. This is important because when you gather your traditional historic precipitation and you use that to talk about what's been happening, the big thing that's obviously missing in the room is the impact of climate conditions on that, the RCP pathways, if you will, to drop in a very, scientific term. The RCP pathways are really how we see, the temperature changes happening in the future. So for our team, what we do is model kind of 3 different scenarios, the good, better, and worse, if you will, to understand a degree of risk that happens in the future to communities. And in doing so, that we can really understand how the past looks different from the future and do a little bit of a gap analysis to understand where places are going to be most vulnerable. We work to do surveys, community forums, even talk to community experts by interviewing officials, facilities managers, utilities, anybody who's been handling physical pipes, wires, parks, just assets that you can touch throughout the planning process are really good to validate the experiences of the kind of scientific data you find. And then, of course, we work to build up the design and planning solutions, the natural infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, pointing to places around DC that need even biosystems management encouragement. But then I think most importantly, and something that I'm going to talk about for maybe the remaining portion, and again, driving home why it's important to have an updated perspective on climate, is talking about how zoning and land use changes often now can show you where the insurance gap analysis protection is, and how you can help even through comprehensive master planning right now, even really help influence community rating systems and the tracking and monitoring. So I know what I'm talking about is kind of a lot. What is parametric insurance? I think insurance is an area that a lot of planners have never had to worry about. We've been able to build, we've been able to tell people where to build. But then it's probably for people on the West Coast and is an area that they're maybe a little bit more informed about. However, to just drive home why it's important to talk about insurance, and of course, California has put it front of mind, but for so many of us, but there's an amazing podcast from The Intelligence, if anybody has time to check it out. Doing parametric modeling, understand how the future looks as compared to why it's different from the past, is very important to point out from a risk perspective for the communities that you're planning in, because if you're not quantifying it correctly, then oftentimes their assets might not be protected concretely. In the US, there's no universal mandate that insurance validates 100% of your value, of your assets value. In California, for instance, if people weren't aware, private insurance doesn't exist because parametric basing your risk off the future is illegal in California, or was until January 2nd this year. What that means is any insurance measures that are taken out for any community were actually really limited to what the historic data was. The problem with that is if you're building or planning a building in a floodplain with a 1 in 100 year event, fine, you're going to be insured for $5,000. But in reality, when we look with climate change, it actually might be a 1 in 20 year event, and you might need $1 million worth of insurance. That gap, I think, is probably what we're going to start talking about, is the insurance equity gap. And doing this type of modeling within your comprehensive master planning, doing that future look, can help make sure that the types of buildings that you built, the types of big projects that you do, are also a little bit less risky than a normal planning project would perhaps lead to. And I know the other panelists in this session are going to give great examples of how further, processes on resilience can make sure that your projects are de-risked. But it's important to point out, I'm sitting here in the city of Pittsburgh. I really appreciated the presentation that showed us as like an emerging climate champion. We've done some work. But for instance, in the city of Pittsburgh here, we had a big bridge accident 2 years ago. And we found out that actually our insurance policy for the city for our bridges was in good faith. which means it's up to taxpayers to fund the city if our city didn't have enough liquid assets or in uninsured spaces. So something for you to check, I think, on any type of plan you do is this area insured? What is really the risk profile? These things sound like a lot, maybe, but there's really great tools out there. Again, we use NOAA, but this is why the difference, I'm going to kind of point to what we found in DC and what this like really looks like and how it impacts us, especially as planners, to work around. Just for DC, the parametric modeling difference we looked at was kind of 3 to 4 inches on average just for rain. We're going to just use rain as an example today. However, whenever you lay this down and we looked at the existing FEMA flood maps, it's like, okay, there's some river areas. When you look at the river height, you can actually see a lot of the Anacostia riverways that were recorded were events that kind of stopped collecting data around 2019 to understand how river flooding might compound with extreme precipitation events. However, another thing that historical analysis often doesn't take in is what's been happening with soil, and soils are impacted by extreme heat. So if people aren't aware on this call, the drier your land is getting, the less absorbent it is actually getting of that water. So looking into the forward, we look anytime we hear that there's rain or precipitation issues, we're making sure that there's not heat issues as well, because if there are, those are compounding problems. And for areas that might just experience normal flooding, that actually means that they might experience knock-on flooding from non-absorbent topographies. This is what it looks like in DC. Here's the problem as well. What we realized from talking with the public there, and this is going to be a quick video, is actually, if you even look at historic data, it won't really show that the rainfall has changed, because traditionally when we take kind of NOAA data, even FEMA data, we measure it within 1 day. A lot of what's happening from climate change now is that amount of rainfall is happening within 15 minutes even. So these are some of the experiences that we started hearing about from citizens. This was a normal amount of rainfall from July 2019, but as you can see, it fell in 15 minutes and not the day. So this is the type of things that we had to take into account in planning, especially this is really in Ward 5. We got into the weeds by then, asking people more and more, so what is your experience like? Because it doesn't say that, you know, it's necessarily going to flood as much in these locations, but what's happening there? How does it impact you leaving? How does it impact you not leaving or not? And it was really interesting to hear. Working with DOE-HESMA, they thought flooding was going to be the biggest example or the biggest problem that everyone had to tackle. And that certainly came up. When we look at Ward 5 or the whole city, it's flooded. I'm going to pause this for one quick second, though, to show you. One thing that was really funny to point out as to why not even every area is secure is one of the areas that was pointed out the most was Pennsylvania Avenue, right in front of the White House, that it was just an absolute disaster to ever have to navigate around. So even when you think of like the richest assets, they're oftentimes stormwater systems aren't designed correctly. However, whenever we started talking to the citizens more and more of DC, the residents of DC and the neighborhoods and even the neighborhood managers there, we started realizing that, yeah, they were worried about flooding, but they kind of knew how to handle it because we hadn't had a grip on flooding for about 10 years. People were really much more worried about heat vulnerabilities. There was no place to go. There was flooding measures. People knew how to handle flooding, but there weren't places to go where it was too hot. There weren't cooling centers. As you can see, what we actually realized is that people weren't talking, and this was one of the major problems with adaptation in DC. When we compared their historical data to the media coverage overall, we actually compared the FEMA maps to where areas were reported, and we were able to kind of identify a bunch of different areas and point to where they needed to have things like blue-green solutions. But most importantly, what we identified actually is where Homeland Security and also DOE needed to more concretely do neighborhood planning and update neighborhood and infrastructure planning. What we realized is that the public had a ton of knowledge and it wasn't being fed back into the city planners. So the most important, I think, findings that came out from this are really knowing that in adaptation, it seemed like the fundamental issue that needed to be solved was public education and communication campaigns. And that was a two-way street. The public knew a lot. The city did not know a lot about what the public was experiencing. We also realized that in going into planning with them afterwards, it was really important to start talking about dedicated resilience positions. yes, cities have sustainability coordinators or not. Some communities had floodplain managers, but it was really important to have dedicated resilience positions. And then that went into re-reviewing where FEMA was already covering places at risk and understanding and recommending where insurance needed to be upgraded throughout the city. So in doing so, we were kind of able to develop a multi-tiered approach, if you will, that looked at what the risk was, the communities who validated it, and then really wrapped that up by talking about where those vulnerabilities needed to be turned into opportunities with projects. As you can see, it was a bit of a website I showed. It's just a bunch of story maps for DC. All of our plans were story maps in totality so that the data can be constantly updated as we get it from communities going forward. There's 5 different ones on the different climate experiences. If you just Google Climate Ready DC story maps, they'll pop up. That's it. Sorry, I tried to stick to 10 minutes for you, Anna.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Katrina. This is really interesting and also so interesting to hear about kind of bridging the gap between the data analysis and the lived experience of the folks you engage through the process. So thank you for sharing that. Next up, we have a presentation by 2 folks from Biohabitats. We have Jennifer Dowdell, who's a practice lead of landscape ecology, planning, and design, as well as Claudia Brown, who is a water resource specialist and Western bioregions lead. And together they'll be talking about 2 case studies in Atlanta and Baltimore that utilized a socio-ecological approach to planning. So Jennifer, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Anna. Great to join you all. And Biohabitats has also been tackling the climate considerations through an ecological framework plans approach that helps guide adaptation and look at approaches for supporting urban and peri-urban resilience. And so we see adaptation strategies through the lens of ecological connectivity and reconnecting communities to the natural landscape and to these underlying ecosystems in our cities and beyond, working with nature, not against it. And so we're thinking about these critical issues associated with water, habitat loss, environmental justice, and critical climate constraints and impacts, including drought, heat, and floodplain. And so in our adaptation perspective of planning and using this ecology leading approach, we're thinking about water and land resources as coupled in terms of resilience and benefits. We're looking at landscape ecological patterns and processes and understanding the different components of those and how they support broader, stronger ecological networks that can also support communities. And so we think of it as a socio-ecological approach to this urban planning approach that may be at the scale of a city, a neighborhood, or even broader at the scale of a couple communities or counties regionally, looking at all the different components that key into that. So we're going to look at 2 examples today at 2 different scales, because it is this idea of thinking of the nested scales of impacts and the way we can think of all these within the context of ecosystems and ecological function. But similar to what Katrina shared in DC, we often start these projects with a deeper dive into community experience and the generational knowledge of nature and ecology that is embedded with residents' experience, their lived experience in nature and in community. And then we use these stories and the knowledge that they bring from their long-term generational experiences of nature to inform our urban ecological framework planning process that then integrates their input as geospatial data layers that can be embedded within more complex analysis of data that's associated with the underlying complexity of ecosystems and these interrelated ecological patterns and processes that we can look at the scale of a city. So this example is work that we did a few years back with the city of Atlanta to help develop an urban ecology framework that they've called Atlanta City Design Nature that helps guide their future development and understanding the opportunities for balancing population growth and the need for economic development and revitalization with a strong community and ecological frame and basis. So this is combining and understanding the goals that the client has identified with the community and then attaching them to different categories of very detailed data analysis across key themes. And we've seen many overlaps with some of the other speakers this afternoon, but we are looking at data layers that can feed in that really help us understand the opportunity to drive this idea of adaptation and climate resilience for the community by better connecting systems, both community systems and natural systems. So we're thinking about habitat and biodiversity, parks and open space, ecosystem services, access to parks and open space, and that question of equity for that. And then other environmental justice considerations and climate justice considerations, similar to what we heard earlier. You can see even this idea of understanding urban heat island and how that impacts some vulnerable communities, and weaving all of these data layers together to help get a better picture of the city's constraints and also opportunities for building on an ecological framework that helps bring healthier experiences and opportunities to community members. A part of this that really leans into ecology is also understanding the connectivity across a city like Atlanta for urban wildlife, and digging into that to understand how we can also look for protecting resources, protecting natural and area open spaces to support very specific wildlife that are also residents of these communities and their needs in habitat and biodiversity considerations for the city itself. Using all of that, we develop these very comprehensive citywide planning frameworks. So this is the final city design for Atlanta, where we're bringing together 5 key themes that help support understanding how future development is directed, how future opportunities for creating open space and accessibility and healthier spaces for community. So those fell into 5 themes for Atlanta: design for wildness, design for comfort, design for retreat and adventure, design for connections, and design for lifestyle. And so lifestyle is the one that really starts to dig into understanding where you can start to see very smart growth and economic development, but also within this construct of trying to increase the neighborhood health, the community access considerations, addressing urban heat island with that center core area of Atlanta, increasing tree canopy, and overall trying to protect these incredible ecological resources that the city has existing. This then drives the opportunity for protection priorities that the city can then follow up on as they look to help acquire new open space perhaps, or even help manage different kinds of development patterns across the city. What this also essentially does is highlight opportunities to treat other types of issues associated with climate change, like flooding and stormwater management. So part of the consideration, of course, through this whole process was how do we integrate green infrastructure into this framework in a way that really leans into ecological considerations and natural conditions and natural function in the landscape. And to wrap up this example, I want to highlight that at the end of all of this, what's really exciting is that there are then local NGOs and nonprofit partners like the Conservation Fund, who's very active in the city of Atlanta, who then can use this kind of work as a guide for acquiring land, protecting land, and creating new accessible spaces for community to do all sorts of things within the city that are celebrating nature, celebrating connections to nature, even access to food through a more interconnected green space network that's supporting and creating all these overlapping and cascading impacts for ecosystem services. Now we're going to look at a different example that Claudia is going to share that's more on a countywide scale.
Hi all. So in the Denver area, we scaled up the approach from Atlanta to a 7-county area. And the purpose was to help lay the foundation for co-creating a regional vision for people and nature, which is being led by a partnership called the Metro Denver Nature Alliance, or Metro DNA, and the Nature Conservancy is a founding member. And in this region, there are several very distinct ecosystems, ranging from the foothills of the Rockies all the way to the prairies, with some very rich biodiversity and a wide range of wildlife that are supported by these diverse habitats. But because of the intense rapid growth in the region, the communities and the natural systems have been really stressed. And so MDNA and TNC recognize this need to align and leverage all of the many nature-based efforts that were underway with a shared vision for based on resiliency. So working with TNC, we established the study area for a regional conservation assessment, which went beyond just the political boundaries to incorporate the watersheds as a way of recognizing and incorporating the natural systems. And then we established the land cover classification for this over 1,000 square mile area at a very detailed level as the basis for the analysis. Next thing we did was to lump those land categories into 3 habitat types for forest, grassland, and shrubs because of the wide range of species and ecosystems we have, and evaluate the habitat quality for each of the habitat types separately using a range of criteria, and then integrating those into one database, where the darker blue or darker colors shows important habitat source areas, which is going to be an input for the connectivity analysis. We then, oops, I don't know if we lost connectivity here. Oh, there we go. Another important aspect of the study is this resistance layer. And that's where every pixel of your database gets assigned a value for how difficult it is or easy for wildlife to move through the system. So the reds are the highest, hardest barrier areas, and then the lighter colors are easier or similar to habitat to move through for general wildlife. So then putting those two things together, we include the habitat sources and the resistance to model connectivity across the landscape. And so again, the model's done separately for each habitat type and then joined together to create this system-wide network of interconnected habitat. And as you can see, though, in the middle, there is a kind of a white area where Denver's located. And so now we're in the process of doing a phase 2 for a follow-up study that is focused on a finer grain analysis for pollinator connectivity and riparian habitat and general habitat in the urban areas that the city will use to help guide their green infrastructure planning and open space and acquisition planning. And a key output from the study was this tool that the Nature Conservancy developed, and it's a great model for, I think, other communities could do, which is available to the public and helps folks know where they're located in the ecosystems, what the quality of their area is, and where there are opportunities for connection or improvements. And now, parallel to what we were doing, an equity assessment was being done. And so now the two are being brought together as the framework for this shared vision. And the mechanism for developing that vision is starting out with pilot projects, as well as convenings and several other conversations that are ongoing. But last year was the first year of the pilot projects. We had about a dozen or so applicants, and it's just been fascinating to see the way that people are interpreting and discovering and exploring ways to build the stories for connectivity in different in their communities and in different interpretations to get to these regional outcomes for both nature and people. And then we have some examples of the ones that were done last year, because they were just, some of them were tree planting and some of them were farm enhancements. But in the upper left was one that was focused on incorporating traditional ecological knowledge in a large park. There was also an acquisition from a land trust in the lower left for a community land trust that includes housing. There's a really exciting and beautiful open space that a disadvantaged community now has access to, or the planning is in the works for how to enhance that. And there were tree studies related to climate impacts and soil moisture. So it's just been a really exciting time, and the momentum is really growing among these partners. There's about 50 of them, and they're able now to use common language and to share their stories and adaptation strategies across a wide array of experiences. The applicants this year include a climate camp for kids and deep paving and school gardens and youth leadership development. And in a time, I think, when we're all there's a lot of sobering news, it's just a really inspiring and exciting time to be a part of a new way of building community connections. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Claudia. It's really interesting to hear this perspective of adaptation from the ecological perspective and reconnecting communities to nature. It's really inspiring. So thank you. So next up, we have Megan O'Hara, who's principal and CEO of Urban Design Associates. And she will speak about a wildfire resilience project in Paradise, California. I believe we'll also touch on a coastal resilience project in Louisiana as well. So Megan, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Anna. And given the recent news, I think it's probably worthwhile for us to spend all of my 10 minutes on the wildfire resilience project in California. And before I jump into this, I'm with Urban Design Associates, are also based here in Pittsburgh, but working internationally. I just want to start out by saying that I think we've all been sobered by watching the recent events in California. And to start this presentation, understand that we need to have quite a bit of humility when we're talking about adaptation, because you're hearing all sorts of best practices, and certainly we've learned a lot over the past decades. But the reality is that the climate change and the disaster rate is oftentimes at a rate much quicker than the rate of adaptation. And even when we put all of the best practice measures into place, sometimes it's no match for a really catastrophic event. So to tell the story of Paradise, Paradise is located a few hours north of Sacramento, up the ridge from Chico. And there's two canyons on either side. So this is the Butte Canyon, and on the other side, you have the Feather River Canyon. And so it's up on this plateau. It's really quite spectacular. It was part of the gold rush historically, and then it became a location for logging and the timber industry. And then eventually, once all of the historic trees were cleared, it was a place of agriculture and industry. And actually, a lot of apple orchards became some of the predominant landscape in Paradise. But as that phased out, a lot of the pines that are natural and indigenous to that area grew back. And you can see that what the conditions were before the fire in 2018. And residents said it was like camping every day. You know, it was low density. There was actually a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. There were beautiful wooded areas, but that also meant that there was quite a bit of fuel for the fire. So on November 8th, 2018, the fire started on the other side of the Feather River, and fire had never actually jumped over that canyon, but very similar to what was happening in LA, there were extremely strong winds. And so you can see how quickly the embers jumped across that canyon. And in just 30 minutes, from 7:07 to 7:37, the fire was already threatening the town. At this time, you had children on buses going to school, you had people going to work, and it really was the perfect storm in terms of all of these conditions. You also had fires further south in California that were diverting a lot of CAL FIRE's resources that trucks then had to turn around and head north to Paradise, and there were dueling fires, just like we've been seeing in the past few weeks. So within an hour, it was quite catastrophic. It's traumatizing to see these images, very similar to the things we've been seeing on the news, but the fire engulfed the entire town and some of the surrounding areas. And the reality of Paradise is that because it's up on that ridge, or up on the plateau and bounded by these canyons, the number of evacuation routes were limited. So the fire was already impacting the area to the north. Everyone was headed south to Chico, and there were only a number of limited evacuation routes. You actually had utility poles falling across the evacuation routes and trees falling across the evacuation routes. So people were being blocked in their attempts to evacuate. On November 7th, you can see what the residential pattern looked like. And on November 8th, that was the remaining homes and buildings that were left in Paradise. It destroyed over 18,000 structures and about 95% of the structures in Paradise, which before the fire had a population of around 26,000. So again, the images are harrowing. Unfortunately, they're quite familiar. And even as the built landscape was completely decimated, nature started to return to paradise. Those 26,000 people evacuated largely to the surrounding counties, primarily to Chico. So you can sort of see the tri-county population area. But in our attempts to put together a recovery plan, people had actually evacuated all across the US. And these were the locations of the updated FEMA addresses and the folks that we were going to try to engage in putting together the recovery plan. So quite a major task, especially in 2018, before we had all of these great tools that the pandemic helped us develop. The Camp Fire is still, unfortunately, the most deadly fire in California's history. 85 people lost their lives in the fire, and it was largely due to not understanding the urgency of evacuation, having vulnerabilities. A lot of older citizens passed away, and trying to evacuate and not being able to. You know, in the ruins, Shane Grammer, an artist who was based in LA, came up and painted these faces of hope on the ruins. And I think the community was really looking for something to bring them together. So the Community Foundation funded a recovery planning process, and UDA was hired by the town to lead that process. They asked us, how do you rebuild a town? And we said, you ask the residents. Again, this is where the humility comes in. I think as planners, we think that we know the answers, but in reality, like Katrina mentioned, there's a lot of knowledge on the ground in terms of people understanding what the answers are, for the best answers for them. So in early meetings, we had over 600 people. This was the first time that many people had been back up to the ridge. The water supply systems had been contaminated during the process of the fire. And so there was a church that had well water. And we had, I think, 6 documentary crews here over the course of several evenings, asked people to think about the disaster in a new lens and think about how it's an opportunity to build more resiliently in the future. We had small group discussions. We listened to every single person's story who showed up at a meeting. We had fairs, resource fairs, to offer connections to local service providers and agencies. And community members voted on recovery projects so that they could prioritize them, which led to a recovery plan that had about 45 individual recovery projects, each with a tier of priority and understanding of who the public and private partners would be to help implement it. They fit into 5 categories of make it safer, make it welcoming, make it stronger, make it better, and make it greener. And then less than 4 months after we started that plan, it was adopted unanimously by City Council in June, and they got to work on implementing. I think one of the biggest travesties of these disasters is that the naturally occurring affordable housing, it disappears. Because as we all know, with construction costs and insurance costs and interest rates, rebuilding is de facto more expensive than the original construction. So as a part of the recovery planning process, we saw that we had to address kind of 3 prongs of the planning. First was the post-fire recovery. Much of that was underway, but there were elements of planning that needed to be integrated quickly. There was also regional resiliency, thinking about how this region can economically bounce back. And then there's the idea of long-term adaptation. You know, how do we keep pace with that ever-changing, increasing climate change risk? The timeline is interesting, I think. The recovery plan, the original recovery plan, happened at the exact same time as the emergency response. It was quite expedited, and they issued their first permit, I think, in February of 2019. So that tells you just how quickly they had to mobilize to start rebuilding. Within 3 years, they had completed so many of the recovery plan projects that they were ready for a plan update, which we helped them with in 2022. And then you can see how the rebuilding has escalated from there. This date is a little bit old, but back in 2024, when we were about 5.5 years after the first building permit, they had still only rebuilt 20% of the homes that were destroyed. So the pipeline in terms of how quickly homes can be built back is constrained even in large metro areas, but certainly in more remote areas. And you can see that 72% of the homes rebuilt were stick built and about 28% were manufactured homes. Paradise had quite a large percentage of manufactured homes and mobile home parks, which provided a lot of that affordable housing. And then through the process, we developed these wildfire adaptation principles. So these are sort of practical things, I think, in your planning work that you can incorporate. If you're at the regional scale, we're looking at managing the forest, creating fire breaks, hardening infrastructure, thinking about redundant emergency notification systems, and providing multiple routes of ingress and egress. At the community scale, dead-end streets proved to be a very big issue in Paradise, and I think we should all be cognizant of what that means for egress, and then fuel reduction in neighborhoods at the neighborhood scale. At the home scale, codifying defensible space is probably the best thing that we can do, requiring resilient building shell materials and then aggressive code enforcement in wildfire-prone areas. So the defensible space zones, thinking about what's immediately adjacent to the house, there really should be absolutely nothing, no landscape, no fencing touching the house. And then there are these zones, up to 30 feet is quite an important zone, thinking about making sure that there's no branches overhanging roofs, that their, fence gates are disconnected. And then there's a zone kind of from 30 to 100 feet. So in closing, again, more practical things that you can incorporate into your planning. The defensible space regulations in any fire-prone area are extremely important. And as we saw last summer, even areas on the East Coast and the Northeast are prone to wildfires. And then on the building design side, looking at the WUI code standards as the gold standard of building design. And then there's a number of building material as well as building design elements, thinking about manufactured homes and how they should have permanent enclosed foundations to prevent ember intrusion, thinking about setbacks between structures and combustible materials, and minimum roof pitches for shedding needles and leaves.
Great. Thank you, Megan. We very much appreciate you sharing that example. Very, again, sobering given the recent news, and also appreciate the reminder to have humility in these planning processes, because oftentimes we come at it from that planning perspective or scientific perspective, and these are issues that are impacting folks on the ground, especially right after such traumatic events. So appreciate you sharing your approach there. So before we go into the last presentation, just a quick reminder to put your questions into the Q&A box. We've already had a few that were answered in that box, but please feel free to put your questions in there for our panelists. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Amelia Soljic, who is a climate resilience specialist at ICF, and she will speak about a proactive approach to climate adaptation planning in Cook County. So Amelia, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Can you guys all see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for having me today. I'm super excited about this, and I have hopefully an interesting presentation to share on a little case study. So, hello, everybody. My name is Amelia Soljic. I am a climate resilience specialist at ICF, and I'm really excited to be speaking to this work. We've been doing this in Cook County, Illinois, to conduct inclusive, iterative climate resilience planning. This has really been a team effort with Geosyntec Consultants and Metro Strategies Group, and the county has been a really amazing partner through all of this. So just for a little bit of background, I can switch to this next slide here if it will go. Okay. So Cook County experiences regular and really expansive urban flooding. Extreme rainfall and flooding in the summer of 2023, which is all pictured here, led to a state disaster proclamation and also triggered federal disaster funding. This type of flooding renders roadways and critical facilities inaccessible. It has caused millions of dollars of property damage, and it has led to innumerable impacts to the health and well-being of the affected communities. And of course, Cook County's low-income and minority communities are disproportionately impacted by these hazards and burdened by the downstream effects. So In response to these escalating and inequitable threats, Cook County is pursuing localized resilience planning through funding from the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, for these 5 historically overburdened communities that you see on the map here, which all face persistent climate and stormwater impacts. The communities were selected through a user-friendly and competitive process, which was open to all county municipalities. And this process considered climate and environmental justice data, capacity needs, interviews, and more. So this project has been split into 2 phases. Phase 1, which is what we're doing right now, has entailed identifying priority climate hazard locations, and developing a set of resilience actions to address those priorities. We're currently wrapping up this phase, and when we're done, each of those 5 municipalities will be equipped with a comprehensive climate resilience plan, which will roll immediately into phase 2 initial implementation, which is super exciting. But beyond the context of just this specific project, this process that I have illustrated here reflects a pretty standard and straightforward approach to resilience planning. And typically including community engagement might look something like this. You might meet with stakeholders to corroborate like hazard locations that you've identified, or you might collect their input on potential solutions to inform your path forward. But to develop a plan that truly reflects a community's values and goals and visions, inclusivity needs to be really thoroughly interwoven every step of the way. And, a process then might look something more like this. And this is actually a more accurate depiction of the process that we have taken in Cook County. We took a very broad iterative approach to community engagement, and through a year-long series of engagement sessions, we've reached more than 950 people. These sessions have ranged from workshops with municipal staff to strategic public-facing events like, for example, a pop-up tent at a local gathering for passport renewal in a community that has a really prominent immigrant population. And throughout this process, our team has iteratively integrated what we learned each step of the way to develop these bespoke paths to resilience for each of the 5 municipalities. I really want to take a look at our approach to determining hazard locations as an example of this iterative process really quickly. So we corroborated and iterated the results of our climate and flood model, so like what we had identified quantitatively, with the lived experiences and historical knowledge of municipal staff, regional experts, community members, public works staff. We validated our findings again with municipal staff. We explored the nuances of each of these locations in person, and we solicited any final input from community members at an open house just recently in November. So the key to all of this, throughout this process, we have prioritized community education with a clear through line. We have found that that has really been the key to ensuring that the engagement process is equitable and accessible, because establishing this shared vocabulary each step of the way, you empower every stakeholder to provide actually well-informed input. So with the time that I have left, I want to share some of the materials and exercises that we developed to establish this shared vocabulary. To start, it can obviously be tricky to convey the value of looking forward and looking to the future when a community is already overburdened in the present. And with this in mind, we felt that it was important to convey the quantitative results of our climate assessment in a well-rounded, accessible, and accurate way. So we shared simplified infographics like this one shown here, but we also walked participants through more complex maps that actually reflected the climate and flooding variables of interests. And participants interacted with these materials at several touch points, which ultimately prepared them to think about the value of resilience planning and the localized impact that these climate threats might have in their community. For example, as recently as those public-facing open houses in November that I mentioned, participants use these familiar materials to guide their thinking about any additional hazard hotspots in their community. Next, and before we proposed any solutions to these hazards, we helped residents develop a comprehensive understanding of the benefits and the trade-offs associated with the possible solution types. So we developed these profiles with this template that you see here on 7 major categories of flood mitigation solutions. For example, here is the profile that we shared on naturalized detention ponds. The other solution categories included things like small-scale green infrastructure, permeable pavement, and others. And as you can see, these profiles detail the hazards that the solution directly addresses, and those graphics should look familiar, and the solution's associated co-benefits with some key relative metrics. And after interacting with these materials on several occasions, the residents have become pretty well versed in the trade-offs associated with each of these solutions. Now, this was all really critical groundwork for the next step of resilience planning, which is determining what solutions are ultimately pursued and when. And our team built upon these profiles to develop an interactive exercise to engage residents with that prioritization process. So we used those project metrics from these profiles to create a physical puzzle piece, or a solution tile, we were calling it, that represented each solution type. So the 3 restrictive project metrics that you see there, timeline, cost, and footprint, determined the size of the tile. So smaller tiles represented cheaper and more straightforward solutions. Tiles that were larger represented solutions that are generally more costly and complex. And the color of each tile indicated how effective that solution type is at flood mitigation, so that hazard reduction metric. So this is what all 7 solution tiles looked like, and you can see that they range pretty widely in the level of effort that they require and how effective they are, and it's pretty tangible and visible. And now on a large printed game board, this is all like physical exercise, participants fit as many of those tiles as they could into this rectangle, which represented the boundaries of the resilience plan. So this required them to balance their personal preferences with the restrictive parameters of the plan. They worked together, sometimes alone, to maximize the hazard reduction accomplished with the set of projects that they were proposing to implement now, soon, or later, as you could see on the bottom. So an example of a populated game board might look something like this. And in real life, it looked something like this. And the feedback that we gathered throughout this process really shaped the ultimate list of adaptation actions that our team developed for each community. So each action outlines a concrete step towards resilience. And for each action, we outlined a path for how that action might be initiated, implemented, monitored. And this is a pretty custom approach because it's not always realistic to tie an adaptation measure to some climate threshold, like a certain number of feet of sea level rise or something. So instead, each of these actions, it's a little bit small, but you could see here, each of those actions is triggered by what we call a catalyst, like those blue circles. Like that could be a funding opportunity, for example, which makes pursuing any given action a little bit more achievable and accessible because it's catalyzed by something pretty tangible, like funding, for example, or an opportunity for regional collaboration. And taken together, all of these different actions are the building blocks for community-specific adaptation pathways. And there's an example, obviously, here. These adaptation pathways offer a strategic framework that outline how each municipality might efficiently sequence and prioritize and implement, evaluate, and iterate their custom set of actions over the coming decades to become more resilient through actions that have been truly shaped by these communities at large. So looking to the future a little bit, the county is now going to start working with CIS Solutions to start implementing some of the solutions outlined in these plans, which is very exciting. And you'll have to stay tuned for how that goes. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. It's really interesting to hear about how this process prioritized community education and the kind of unique approaches you took to engage folks. And 950 people is a lot of people, so that's really exciting to hear.
Yeah.
So we have so we have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to invite our panelists to turn their cameras on for the question and answer session. I've got a couple of questions to get us started, and then we'll see what questions we have in the Q&A box from our audience here. But the first question I have is kind of a reaction to how you all discussed community engagement. It was a really big part of all of the case studies that you all shared. And we know that communities are wrestling with both climate stresses, so impacts that build over time, like increasing temperatures. They're also wrestling with climate shocks, like hurricanes and wildfires, these big, extreme events. And so I'm curious what you've been hearing from communities who are wrestling with the impacts of climate change, and they might be debating whether to rebuild after an extreme event, debating whether to move, or how they're going to manage as climate change intensifies. How are they weighing the trade-offs of these different options? So curious to hear what you all have been hearing from the communities you're working with. Any volunteers to answer that question first?
I can kick us off. So I think it's important for us to or just to remind ourselves that when people are making that decision, it's not in a vacuum, and it's often not rational in the way that we think about those decisions. You know, we look at it and think this is going to keep happening over and over again. And of course, the long-term costs are oftentimes more than the short-term cost of moving, but it's an emotional decision, and people have been through trauma often when they're making that decision. There's also equity and vulnerability components that lead people either to have to move or to not be able to move, whether it be family networks or other factors. And so I think the reality is that when something like this happens, you see an enormous surge of people wanting to rebuild and to stay, because in a way it is reflective of their own personal resilience. And so when we surveyed Paradise, I think 90% of people said that they were going to come back and rebuild on their property. In the end, I think 30% of existing residents have returned. And so as more time goes on, the decision-making factors change. But those who were insured and could come back and could rebuild quickly were very determined to do so.
We're finding that something that we even talked about as a panel, I think, before this discussion was there's also cultural aspects that are tied to it, like Megan says, that are beyond just the person living in the home. You know, these are oftentimes communities and generations of people who have lived there. So when you're asking people, should they move, should they reconsider their lifestyles, their home, if you will, you're asking them to actually really evaluate their habits of their daily life, the things that they've learned and become accustomed to, as Megan said, but also part of their cultural identity. I mean, Louisiana is the best example of that, right? Like just telling people to leave an area that gets flooded over and over again completely defies, you know, what the heart of kind of Creole culture is, not just in, you know, what the people experience, but in the food and the cuisine, even in the music that people talk about. So it's hard to also not want to help people take the positive approach as well. I guess the positive side of human history is adaptation does come from that, you know, purely biological science, you know, to take in information, adapt and become better. So I think, you know, seeing the work that Megan did in Paradise, but even seeing the biohabitat stuff come through and seeing really that there's nature-based solutions. I think when people move, what we've at least tried to experience, and it's not just for residents, like for big institutions, is it can be a last resort if really we can try and figure out what the most creative solutions are to build back to a smarter standard, if you will, a better protected standard than previous. And the hard work around that, I think, is mainly financial, as we said, and that's where needing to close the gaps with the financing gaps to make building back more sustainably, more resilient is definitely the biggest challenge for communities.
And Katrina, I know you mentioned this in your presentation. Also, we chatted about it a couple weeks ago of the kind of insurance question, as well as being perhaps a decision-making factor in how folks are going to approach these issues moving forward.
Yeah, if you can't tell, I'm like in an insurance passion point right now, but I feel like all of us probably are, because, you know, 15 years ago, I knew nothing about it, and I've kind of been banging on it, but even my own grandparents in Florida experienced, you know, and I think that's where it hits the vulnerable populations a lot. People who are used to having $50 a month payments, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you think $50 a month for my house, who cares? I think what people underestimate is with one major event, your insurance has the right, if they're private, to readjust. So you can go from $50 a month payment to $1,500 a month payment, and it's up to no one's mercy, or you can be completely dropped. And that's happening all over the place in many coastal areas. And as I pointed to that podcast, but I really do encourage everyone to listen to it, seeing California moving from essentially state-funded insurance to moving towards now privatized insurance. And knowing the history of people who have lived in a lot of these communities, again, for generations and generations, it's really, I don't know how, I hope that we can creatively gather a lot of capital that is in a bunch of different areas and put it together to start creating equitable insurance solutions to protect people rather than help them rebuild. Like that's where, if we can start putting finance into that reactive part, insurance front up front in putting a dollar value on nature-based solutions, for instance, on adaptive capacity, I think it would be literally life-changing.
Great. Any other perspectives on this question from the rest of our panelists? All right, I'll move to my second question. Brian mentioned during the keynote presentation that how we plan is changing because of climate change, and whether you are explicitly engaged in adaptation planning or not, it is going to, or if it isn't already, it's going to impact your work. And so looking at our audience here, I'm sure we have folks joining us who are deeply engaged in this work, but I'm sure most folks aren't as deeply engaged currently, right? And so I'm curious, how can planners incorporate climate adaptation strategies into other types of plans? So comprehensive plans, land use plans, housing plans, other types of plans that don't have adaptation or resilience or climate in the title. Are there tools, resources, strategies you would recommend for the planners on the call?
I can quickly chime in from maybe a slightly tangential perspective, but my background is largely in health and health systems. And we face that question a lot in health and health systems preservation of, how do you actually incorporate climate into, systems where you're trying to preserve healthcare or healthcare delivery services. And something that's really interesting, and I think is generally applicable to applying climate resilience outside of the climate sphere, is like thinking of specific thresholds and determining what data you have that applies really explicitly to the system you're trying to preserve. And, in human health terms, that might be a specific temperature threshold, but, in working with, like electric utilities, for example, that might be a different heat threshold or a different, like some other threshold, right? And so I think that looking to see what data you have that applies to what you're trying to preserve, and then also using that as a sort of like gap framework to figure out what data you might need to start collecting that's going to be useful in incorporating climate into what you're doing. I think that's an ongoing process, but helpful.
And I would add kind of our perspective, looking at all of this all the time through a lens of ecology, is that there might be an opportunity to ask yourselves in any of these other kinds of planning projects, how does nature play a role? How do natural systems play a role? How do ecosystems play a role? You can ask it with any kind of term, but there is always a relationship that we have to nature. And so there might be a way to tie some question about connections to nature rather than an explicit question around climate adaptation. But you might still get a result that is helping you in being more resilient.
I would like to add to that too. Some of our clients are asking for sustainable landscape code guidance and also overlay mapping. I think that making room for the water, making room and breaks for the fire, a lot of these setbacks and traditional knowledge that has been in the past has been lost. And so I think bringing those forward will help us as well. There's some good resources for that.
I feel like a practical thing too is carving out budget for climatology and ecology on every project. The same way that 10 years ago, like hire people like biohabitats, let them do their thing. We have experts in this, get them on your teams. I get frustrated sometimes. I'm like, we don't need to know all the things. We have scientists, we have ecologists, let's hire them. Same way we went after, what's the coolest neighborhood framework for sustainability 15 years ago? Let's just all agree, one thing that we can do is value nature-based solutions, value understanding the environment. So let's put it in our budgets and let's just get those firms on our team, I think.
Yeah, a good point. And I'll just add to that and say, I think also just having a mindset shift as we embark on these projects, that every plan, every project is a climate project, whether it's explicitly stated, whether it's in the title or not, that is, a lens we should all be looking through in this work, whether we're explicitly stating that there are issues or concerns within these topics that we can integrate into our approach, into the priorities, things of that nature. But it's no longer an add-on. It's no longer a nice to have thing. It's an imperative, and all of our plans should be viewed through that lens. Well, we have a couple of questions here in the audience Q&A box. Megan, I see there's one you may have started typing an answer to, but maybe I'll ask it unless you've already finished your typing. But there's one question here about how to balance the need for more biodiversity and neighborhood plantings versus the need to remove trees near homes related to fires. So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a great question. I think it's important that we acknowledge up front that there are going to be competing priorities. And the big one I think that the fires in LA have brought up is the housing crisis, which requires more density and more housing with the types of fire breaks and reducing wildfire risk, which actually requires us to space buildings out and probably to have fewer housing units on the same amount of land, right? So we'd love to have a solution that solves for everything, but the reality is that there are choices that have to be made, and our jobs as planners are to help communities make the choices that incur the least harm. So I feel like with biodiversity, there's the mix of what the plant material and the landscaping and the trees are, and then there's how much of it and where it is, right? So the wildfire risk is talking about where it should be located and where it should not be located and how much vegetation we have, and not necessarily about the mix of what the species are. So there's probably still some opportunity for biodiversity in neighborhoods, but we may need to concentrate those habitats into larger, more wild areas, which I think has its own kind of set of challenges. But I'd love to hear what Claudia and Jennifer think about that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be either or. I think there's a role for smaller patches as well. I think holding moisture in the landscape is important. We talk about beaver dam analogs and wetlands and waterways a lot. I think not only what is there and where it is located, but how it's managed is important. And that care is, we did a climate vulnerability analysis for the City of Austin Parks Department, and a big part of it was of the risk management was identifying fuels management. And so staffing up has been really hard. They have a position right now if anybody's interested for fire management help, because that's really where we're at, is like we need to be moving our workforces from some of the older, mow and blow type services in landscape management to more stewardship management. So it's a complicated question, but a good one.
And even the question of biodiversity in some of these communities have experienced historic changes in the plant communities, and these plant communities have evolved towards monocultures of non-native invasive species. And so if we can think about ecological restoration and the potential, when it is balanced with what Megan has brought up with regard to safety and the need for some changes in the way maybe landscapes are designed around buildings, there's still an opportunity to reintroduce native plant palettes that may not have the same fuel load, and as to Claudia's point, may actually help create microclimates where there is more moisture.
That's such a great point, because, I don't know if anybody heard the NPR fire historian the other day, but he was saying, fire has been around as long as we have as a friend, and we've made it our worst enemy, and we need to reconnect our relationship with fire in a way that's more healthy. The ecosystems can bounce back if we are thinking from an ecosystem perspective and working with them. I'm not to discount anything, the trauma of what Megan has been describing, and like that's not going to fix what happened to people's homes or anything, but it might minimize it. There was an article, also a story about Marshall Fire here that just happened, and people rebuilding using basically adobe structures. And so, being more sensitive and bringing forward that ecological knowledge, or the traditional knowledge, is another tool we can use.
When even in planning, the connection between ecology and water is, I feel like we've been so focused on energy and carbon for so long, which is fundamentally, of course, important. But understanding what water conservation and actually as like Megan said, what the trade-off is between those areas, are something that planners are really well posed to do. I feel like we did the comprehensive master plan in Las Vegas a couple years ago, and it was quite daunting to look at kind of what was happening in the dam levels that were happening in the Hoover Dam at the level of seeing their water fluctuate, and then kind of going to the housing commissions and being like, your WUI has to go down 20%. By the way, a bunch of the species that you're recommending for your lawns are non-native. They've got to be cut out. So actually, we're going to give you lawn recommendations, sustainable design guidelines that are like, apologies, I'm not a landscape architect, we're like rock-based, like desert-based arid solutions. And so I think too, to that point, I think maybe for me, because I lived in London for a long time, we weren't allowed to have house fires. Like you can't have them. They're outlawed from the 1800s because of the London fires. I think planners taking that regulatory role a little bit too and pointing towards what the regulations for appropriateness are can protect future developments too as they come along. And those design guidelines, for ecology, what's appropriate and what's not, but even in those comp plans, zooming out and identifying where your green space is and where it can't be, is important to look at with those water tables now more and more.
At the comp plan level, I think there's also a great opportunity for community resilience resource centers, with a little bit of additional hardening or a little bit of additional design, your parks, your community centers, your schools, your fire stations, these become the areas of refuge where firefighting can be done, or that are outside of floodplains and where the distribution of resources happen. And I feel like that that social infrastructure layer of thinking about whether we're building back or we're designing in comp plans and master plans, we can think about doubling up on these investments that are going to go in anyways and making a bit more of an investment to make these areas more resilient so that when a disaster does happen, you have resources built into your community.
Go ahead, Claudia. Were you going to add something there?
We're almost out of time, so I think the next question is really important.
Yeah. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I will maybe just ask this one last question, and we can open it up. Shannon or Donnie, Christine, Carla, if you have answers to this as well. Maybe we'll just take one or two answers. So we have a question here. Given the realities of the new administration in DC, are you at all optimistic? How will you continue your work? What do you see are or will be the coming challenges to advancing the progress and urgently needed and proven planning and design approaches that have been presented today? So a bit of a big question, but curious if we have an answer or two to this before we wrap up today.
I have a partial answer. I have a sticker on my reusable water bottle that says stubborn optimist. And I just choose to be optimistic because of all the people that have attended the session today, all the people doing great work across the country at every level. And I think we just need to keep on doing the good work we're doing. We're making a difference. And just to continue doing that regardless of policy changes that we have no control over. So I choose to focus on things I can change and impact and not get too upset about the things I can't.
I'll jump in to say too,
I think after 2016, we felt a similar kind of what's going to happen. And it was encouraging to see the commitment of cities and states step up. And I think there's been a lot of talk about cities. I'm getting choked up even. It's just the work will go on and it's going to happen at the grassroots level.
I feel like if anybody isn't feeling like it, I think a bit different, as we said in 2016 compared to today. I feel like Michelle Obama is embracing it right now, which is like, okay, they went low, we're going to go higher. And now it's like, we go low, we're going to get lower. Like we work in cities, we work in local governments, we know the foundations, we know the people. Before, I feel like we try to negotiate. Now I feel it's like more important to make demands, to make sure every plan that we're doing says we must have this. If not, you're leaving these populations, da 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 da. So I think before, I don't know about anyone in this call, but before, we were kind of like, oh, we're a private company. Our job is to keep helping communities, keep doing the thing. And of course, the federal government is flip-flopping, and it's horrible to see, but I think it's led us all to be like, well, it's time to speak up then. So hopefully, yeah, I'm just looking forward to getting even feistier. I was very proudly part of the Pittsburgh to Paris debacle last time, and I know Anna is very probably proud of that as well too. But like one of the greatest joys of my life has been seeing my own mayor get in like live Twitter fights with, you know, that man. And so I just hope it happens again, honestly. And I know that's maybe I shouldn't say, but like let's do it. Let's fight the good fight.
I know we're at time, but Amelia, I think you were gonna want to make sure if you had a few words if you wanted to share those.
I was going to say exactly what Claudia said, but she said it better than I was going to. So, but yeah, in 2016, our work in particular really shifted from federal work to state and local and county and MSAs. And that definitely is the thing that has made me the most hopeful, and seeing these localized climate action groups and regional agencies really take charge. And so that's great. And we all know that localized action is the best action. So
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is a good, a hopeful note to end on, so I appreciate that. Shannon, Carla, or Christine, do you have any final words before we wrap up today?
Just head over to our website or YouTube channel to get a recording of the session, or to the Sustainable Communities Division website. I'm sure I'll get a link over to them. And thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Anna. Bye.